She was 22 years old. She had walked 3 days through a Montana blizzard with nothing in her hand but her dead mother's gold ring. And now she was standing in a stone cellar in the dark with a Colt revolver pointed at the throat of the man who had told her the husband she had come west to marry was dead and buried in a churchyard. The man was smiling. He thought she would not pull the trigger. He was about to learn in the last clear second of his old life exactly how wrong a man can be about a Boston girl who has nothing left to lose. Pull up your chair by the fire. Let me tell you how she got there. The wind that came down from the Bitterroot Range that December afternoon carried the smell of iron and old snow, the kind of wind that bent the lodgepole pines until their crowns scraped the gray sky like the fingers of drowning men. It moved across the high meadows in long, howling sheets, lifting powder from the drifts and flinging it sideways through the timber, and anything alive that day had the good sense to be sheltered in stone or wood or fur. Anything alive except one woman. She came down through the trees the way a ghost comes down slow and stumbling, her boots making small broken sounds in the crust. The dress she wore had once been navy blue, the color of a summer evening over Boston Harbor, but now it was the color of bruised plums where the blood and the wet had soaked through. The hem was ribboned where briars had taken it. The collar, which had once been pinned with a small cameo brooch, was bare. Her hair, that honey-colored hair her mother had brushed every night of her childhood by lamplight, was frozen in pale ropes against her temples. In her right hand, balled into a fist so tight the knuckles showed white through the chapped red skin, she carried a single thing, a ring. A small circle of soft gold no wider than the nail of her smallest finger. It was not her wedding ring. She had never been married. It was her mother's, and it was the last thing in the world she owned. Her name was Adelaide Ashford, but the people who had loved her had always called her Della, and there was nobody left now to call her anything at all. She had stopped feeling her toes somewhere in the second day. Her face had stopped feeling like her face. There was a part of her, a small, clear part, that watched the rest of her stumble forward through the timber that understood quite calmly that she was dying. It was not a frightening understanding. It was almost a relief. She had been afraid for so long, every day for months, that the end of being afraid felt like a kind of warmth she could lean into. The body lay down in the snow because the mind had already lain down somewhere else. But she did not lie down, not yet, because through the black trunks of the pines she saw a thread of smoke. It rose thin and pale against the iron sky, the smoke of a stone chimney that had been burning a long time. She stopped where she stood, swaying on her feet like a sapling in the wind, and she looked at that thread of smoke the way a soul looks at a door it had given up hoping to find. Beneath the smoke, when her eyes adjusted, she saw the cabin. It was huge. Squat and broad-shouldered, built of logs the size of barrels chinked with mud and moss that had weathered to the color of bread crust. There was a long covered porch, and on the porch she could see the dark shape of a wood stack as tall as a man and a single oil lantern burning yellow against the gray. A house, a real house, with smoke and light and the promise of a fire inside. Della Ashford took the ring from inside her fist and held it in her open palm where the failing winter light could find it. The gold caught a thin spark. She closed her hand over it again because she could not afford to drop it. Oh, not now. And she walked the last 100 yards to the porch the way a woman walks to her own hanging. Step, 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 each one a small victory over the snow that wanted to swallow her. She did not knock. She did not have the strength left in her arm to knock. She simply stopped at the foot of the porch steps and stood there, and the wind took her shawl and lifted it like a torn flag, and she opened her mouth to speak, and the words she had been rehearsing for the last 6 miles came out of her in a voice she did not recognize as her own. I have not eaten in 3 days. The cabin door opened. It did not open the way doors open in a hesitant house. It opened the way a door opens when the men inside have already heard you coming, when they have already taken down the rifle from above the lintel, when they have already moved into position. It opened wide and 3 men came out onto the porch. 3. Della had been told there would be one. The first one was the tallest, and she would learn his name later. But in that frozen moment, all she knew was that he stood 6.5 feet of shoulder and whether his hair the color of chestnut bark, with the sun bleached through it, his jaw set hard above 2 days of beard. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight, and they went straight to her closed fist before they went to her face. Behind him stood another half a step back, his hair a touch lighter, his shoulders the same impossible width, his hands bare and scarred and quiet at his sides. And behind him a third the youngest, by a measure with a quicker mouth and a faster eye, his rifle still cradled, but his finger off the trigger because he had already seen what he was looking at, and what he was looking at was not a threat. What he was looking at was a woman about to die on the porch. Della lifted her hand. She opened her fingers. The ring lay there in her chapped palm, a small bright thing in all that gray. "Will you buy my wedding ring?" The tall man in front took one step. Just one. And his face, which had been hard and watchful in the way of a man who had seen too many strangers come up his road, did something then that none of his brothers had seen his face do in 8 years. It went pale, bone pale, the kind of pale that comes when a man sees a thing he has been afraid of seeing for so long that he forgot he was still afraid. He did not look at the ring. He looked at her face. He looked at the honey air frozen against her temples, and the cracked lips, and the cornflower blue eyes that were trying so hard to keep him in focus. And in that look there was something Della was too far gone to read, something old and cracked open and unbearable. She tried to say the rest of the speech she had practiced. She had a whole speech ready about how the ring was real gold, about how she would not ask for charity, about how she would work for any food they could spare, and then walk on to the next place. She had practiced it for 6 miles, but the speech did not come. What came was her knees folding underneath her like wet paper, and the porch boards rising up to meet her, and the last thing she saw before the dark took her was the second brother stepping forward without a word and catching her under the arms before her face could strike the wood. She did not feel herself being lifted. She did not feel the heat of the open door wash over her face. She did not hear the youngest one say low and hoarse, "Oh, sweet, merciful God, look at her. Look at her hands." She did not hear the tall one say nothing at all, because the tall one had no words left. She was already gone into the dark. We are going to walk back 6 weeks now, you and I, because to understand how a woman comes to stand on a stranger's porch with a dead woman's ring in her hand and 3 days of starvation in her belly, you have to understand the road that brought her there. And before we walk back, I want to say something to you. If you are new to this porch, if this is the first story you and I have shared together by the fire, then welcome. Pull up your chair. I tell stories like this one every week, true to the bone, about the men and women who built this country with their hands and their hurt and their stubborn refusing to die. If you would like to hear more of them, hit that subscribe button down below and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I would like to know who is sitting at the fire with me. Now then, back we go, 6 weeks, to Boston. The Ashford house on Beacon Street had once been a fine house. Della could still remember when it had been a fine house, when her father Edmund Ashford had owned the largest dry goods store in the South End and 3 brick warehouses by the harbor, when the front parlor had a piano that nobody could play, but everybody admired, and when her mother Cora had hosted Sunday teas with china cups so thin you could see the outline of your own fingers through them. That had been before the cough started, before the doctor came with his black bag and his soft, defeated face, before the long winter when her father had wasted in the upstairs bedroom while Della sat by his bed and read him the ledgers because his eyes were too tired to read them himself. That was a thing nobody knew about Della Ashford, that her father had taught her to read a ledger. He had started teaching her when she was 14 in secret in the back office of the dry goods store on the long Saturdays when her mother thought she was learning needlework with the Whitcomb girls. He had set the great green ledger book on his desk, and he had shown her how the columns ran, how the credits answered the debits, How a clever man could hide a theft inside a column of ones, and a fool could mistake an honest mistake for a swindle. He had told her, his hand on the back of her chair, that a woman who could read a ledger was a woman who could not be cheated, and that he would not raise a daughter who could be cheated. Della had taken to it the way another girl might take to music. By the time she was 16, she was keeping the books for the South End store on Saturday, and her father was sitting back in his chair and watching her work with a small, proud smile that she would remember every day of her life. When the cough took him in the autumn she was 20, he left them with very little. The warehouses had been mortgaged twice over to cover the doctor's bills. The store was sold inside a month. The fine house on Beacon Street belonged to the bank now in everything but name, and the bank was patient only as long as the widow Cora Ashford continued to be a widow. Cora did not continue to be a widow long. The man she married was named Bartholomew Pierce. He was a coal merchant from the wharves, 50 years old, and broad in the gut with the kind of small, wet eyes that did not quite settle on you when you spoke to him. He paid off the most pressing of the bank's notes inside a fortnight, and on the strength of that paying, he moved into the house on Beacon Street with 2 trunks of clothing and a habit of leaving doors open behind him. He was not unkind to Cora, not in the obvious way. He was simply absent of any kindness at all, the way a stone is absent of music. He looked at Della as a man looks at a horse he has not yet decided whether to keep. And he looked at Lillian, Etta, Della's younger sister, whom everyone called Etta, in a way that made Della's stomach turn cold. Etta was 12 years old. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's quick laugh, and she still believed the way only 12-year-old girls can believe, that the world was a place where things came out right in the end, if you were good. Della loved her more than she had ever loved anything more, even than she had loved their father, because Etta was the last bright thing in the house, and Della had appointed herself in silence the one who would keep that brightness alive. It was in the second week of October that Della overheard Pierce in the front hall speaking to a man she did not know. She was on the back stairs, the ones the servants had used when there had still been servants, and she stopped where she stood with her hand on the rail because the man was asking about Etta. He was asking how soon. He was asking what the price would be. He was asking whether the girl could be made presentable for a man of refined tastes, by which Della understood, with the cold, sudden clarity of a slap, that the man was old and rich and looking for a child wife. And Pierce, in that flat, wet voice of his, was saying that the girl would be ready by Christmas, and that the price was such and such, and that the bank would be pleased to see the Ashford debts settled at last. Della did not move on the stairs. She did not breathe. She stood with her hand on the polished rail her father had varnished himself, and she understood in the space of perhaps 4 heartbeats that her family was finished. Her mother could not be reasoned with any more, because her mother had given up reasoning the day she had married Pierce. The bank would not help. The law would not help, because in 1878 a stepfather had every right under God in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to dispose of his stepdaughter as he saw fit, provided the disposal had the appearance of a marriage. The Whitcomb family would not help, because the Whitcomb family had stopped calling on the Ashfords the day the warehouses were sold. There was nobody. There was only Della. And Della, standing there on the back stairs with the smell of coal dust drifting up from Pierce's cigar in the parlor, made her decision. She would have to leave. That was the first thing. If she stayed in the Ashford house, she would only watch. And watching was a thing she could not survive. But she could not simply leave, because if she left alone, Etta would be sold by Christmas, and there would be no one to come back for her. She would have to leave in such a way that she could come back. She would have to find somewhere in this country that did not love unmarried women, a place where a woman could earn enough to send for a child's sister, a place where nobody knew the name Ashford and nobody owed money to Bartholomew Pierce. The next morning, in the reading room of the Boston Athenaeum, Della Ashford opened a newspaper called the Matrimonial Times. She had heard of such papers from a girl at church in the way one hears of disreputable things, with a half laugh and a turning away. She did not turn away that morning. She read every column. She read the advertisements from widowers in Kansas and lonely shopkeepers in Oregon and railroad men in the Dakotas, and she read them with the cold, steady eye of a woman who was reading a ledger. And on the second to last column of the third page, she found this: honest man, sound of mind and body, holder of mountain ranch in the Bitterroot Range, Montana Territory, seeks decent woman for wife. Passage paid. Reply S. Hollister in care of Silver Creek Post. Della read it 3 times. Honest man. The word honest had been chosen carefully. A man who cared about being called honest was a man who had been called dishonest by somebody and had felt the sting of it. Sound of mind and body, not a brag, a statement the kind a man makes when he is used to his word being doubted. Holder of mountain ranch, holder not owner, a man who knew that the mountain owned him as much as he owned the mountain. Bitterroot Range, she had to find an atlas to learn where that was. Decent woman, not pretty, not young, decent. A man who valued character. She wrote her reply that night by candle in the smallest, neatest hand she could manage. She told the truth mostly. She said her name and her age. She said her father had been a merchant and was now deceased. She said she could cook and clean and sew a straight seam and that she had health and a willing back. She did not say she could read a ledger. That was the one thing she kept for herself, because her father had taught her never to show all of your cards to a man you did not yet know. She walked the letter to the post office herself in the rain, and she paid the postage out of the last of her pin money, and then she went home to the house on Beacon Street, and she waited. For 3 weeks she waited, and during those 3 weeks she watched Pierce make arrangements. She saw the tailor come to measure it Bada for a new dress. She saw Etta stand in the parlor with her arms held out and her face confused, asking why she needed a new dress in the dead of November, and Della had to turn away to the window because she could not let Etta see her face. She saw Pierce write a letter to a man in Providence whose name she did not catch. She saw in her mother's vacant eyes that her mother had stopped asking questions about her own daughters because asking questions had become too painful. And then on the 23rd of November, the reply came. It came in a plain envelope addressed in a hand so firm and square, it looked almost as if the letters had been chiseled rather than written. Della took it up to her room and she sat on the edge of her bed and she opened it with hands that would not stay still. The letter inside was very short. 6 lines. The hand was the same plain, firm hand of the address. Miss Ashford, your letter received. You will do. I have arranged passage for you on the rail line to Cheyenne, and from there by stagecoach to Silver Creek. Funds enclosed. The coach reaches Silver Creek on the 15th of December. I will meet it. There is one thing you should know before you come. I do not live alone. S. Hollister. Della read it 3 times the same way as she had read the advertisement. You will do. Not flowery, but not cruel either. The words of a man who had decided. I have arranged passage. Practical. He had not waited to be asked. There is one thing you should know. Honesty even at the cost of seeming strange. I do not live alone. She did not know what that last line meant. She thought perhaps that he had a mother, or a child from a first marriage, or an aged uncle who had come west with him. She turned the line over in her mind for an hour, and then she set it aside because the only thing that mattered was that the funds were in the envelope, and the funds were enough. Enough to carry her west, enough to carry her away from Pierce. She made her preparations in 3 days. She told no one. She packed only what would fit into a single carpet bag, and on the last night when the house was dark, she went into her mother's room while her mother slept, and she opened the small wooden jewelry box on the dresser. There was very little left in it. Pierce had sold most of it already, but there was one thing he had not sold because he had never thought to look for it: her mother's wedding ring. The thin gold band Edmund Ashford had slipped onto Cora's finger in the spring of 1854. Cora had taken it off the morning of her marriage to Pierce because Pierce had insisted, and she had hidden it in the false bottom of the box where Della had once helped her hide a love letter as a girl. Della took the ring. She took it not because she meant to wear it, and not because she meant ever to sell it, but because it was the last piece of her father's hands that existed in the world. And because if she was going to walk into the Bitterroot Range, she was going to walk in carrying something that had been touched by love. She found a needle and thread in her sewing basket, and she opened the hem of her best traveling dress, the navy blue one with the small lace at the cuffs, and she stitched the ring inside the hem, where no thief and no stepfather and no stranger on a train would ever think to look for it. Then she went into Etta's room. Etta was asleep on her side, one hand under her cheek, the way she had slept since she was a baby. Her brown hair was loose on the pillow. The new dress Pierce had ordered for her was hanging on the wardrobe door, finished now the color of a wedding cake. Della knelt beside the bed and she put her mouth close to her sister's ear, and she whispered the only promise she had left to give. When I am settled, I am coming back for you. I do not know how long it will take, but I will come. I swear it on Father. I swear it on every Sunday he ever held my hand. I am coming back, Etta. Do not let them break you before I come. Etta did not wake. Della kissed her temple. She left the house on Beacon Street at 4 o'clock in the morning before any servant or stepfather was stirring, and she walked to the train station with her carpet bag in her hand and her mother's ring stitched into her hem, and her father's lessons folded inside her like a knife she had not yet shown to anyone. The train took her west for 6 days. She did not sleep much on the train. She watched the country change outside the window, the trees thinning and the ground hardening, and the towns getting smaller and meaner. And she practiced being someone other than Adelaide Ashford of Beacon Street. She practiced being a woman who could chop wood. She practiced being a woman who could endure. She practiced not flinching when men looked at her in the dining car, and she practiced sleeping, sitting upright, with her carpet bag between her ankles so that no one could take it without waking her. By Cheyenne, she had grown thinner. By the stage to Silver Creek, she had grown harder in the small, invisible way a woman grows hard when she has nothing to fall back on. The stage rolled into Silver Creek on the afternoon of December 15th on schedule to the hour, in a thin, spitting snow that was beginning to thicken on the rooftops of the town. Della got down from the coach with her carpet bag in her hand, and she stood in the muddy street, and she looked around for the man who had written, "I will meet it." There was no man. There was a livery boy and a drunk asleep against the rail of the saloon, and 2 old women in wool shawls coming out of the church across the way, but there was no man waiting for her. No man with a wagon, no man with a sign, no man at all. She stood there for 10 minutes in the snow while the stage driver unloaded the mail sacks and the other passengers, 2 ranch hands and a Methodist preacher, dispersed to their warm destinations. She stood there until her carpet bag was getting heavy, and then she walked across the muddy street to the only large building she could see, which was a square false-fronted store with the words Mercer Mercantile painted in fading red across the top. She pushed open the door. The store was warm. That was the first thing. After the cold of the street, it hit her like a blessing. The smell of wood smoke and barreled apples and oiled leather, and she stood for a moment just inside the door, breathing it in. Behind the counter, a great barrel-chested man with a red face and a buffalo coat hung on the peg behind him looked up from his ledger book. He was perhaps 53, with thick white hair and a thicker white mustache, and the smile he turned on Della was the warmest, kindest, most fatherly smile she had seen in many months. "Well now," he said, "you must be the Boston girl." Della felt her shoulders drop a quarter of an inch. Just hearing herself called expected was a balm. "Yes," she said, "I am Adelaide Ashford. I was supposed to be met by Mr. Hollister." The kind smile of the man behind the counter changed in some small way Della could not quite see. It softened. It became sorrowful. He came around the counter, and he stood in front of her with his big red hands held out at his sides as if he did not know what to do with them. "Oh, child," he said. "Oh, child. Nobody told you. Told me what? Sit down, dear. Sit down by the stove. Let me get you a cup of coffee. Oh, dear. Oh, dear, dear me. I had so hoped the letter would reach Boston in time." He guided her to a low bench by the wood stove, and he poured her a tin cup of coffee from a black pot that had been simmering all day, and he stood over her with his white mustache trembling in what looked for all the world like genuine grief. His name, he told her, was Cyrus Mercer. He owned the mercantile, and he was the unofficial banker for half the men in the valley, including, he said, the Hollister boys up on the mountain. Silas Hollister is dead, Miss Ashford. 2 weeks ago, there was an accident on the high pasture. A horse went down on him in a slide. He never came around. We buried him in the churchyard here on the 3rd. Della heard her own voice from a long way off. Dead, dead child. I am so terribly sorry. I tried to write to Boston as soon as it happened, but the mail east is slow this time of year. I was so hoping you would not have set out yet. Della set the tin cup down on the bench beside her because her hands were beginning to shake and she did not want to spill it. His brother, she said. He wrote me that he did not live alone. There are brothers. Mercer's kind face grew more sorrowful still. Brothers, yes, 2 of them, Tobias and Rhett. But Miss Ashford, you must understand, those boys they are not the kind of men you bring a young woman to. They have lived alone on that mountain too long. They have grown wild. Since Silas died, they have not come down to town once. They will not answer when they are called on. They have gone to the wolves up there, if you understand my meaning. It would not be safe for a woman of your refinement to go up to that cabin alone, even if you could find it, which you could not in the snow. The pass will close any day. Della looked at her hands. She made them stop shaking by force of will. I have nowhere to go, she said. I cannot return to Boston. I used the last of my money to come here. Of course you cannot, Mercer said warmly. And you shall not have to. I have a small, clean room above the store. You shall stay there as my guest until we can sort out your situation. We are not heathens in Silver Creek, Miss Ashford. We take care of our own. He reached out then, and he set one big red hand gently on her shoulder, and the touch should have been comforting, and instead it made every hair on Della's neck stand up at once. It was not a fatherly touch. It was the touch of a man checking the warmth of a horse he meant to buy. She did not pull away. She made herself smile, the small, grateful smile her father had taught her to use on customers she did not yet trust, and she said, "Thank you. Mr. Mercer, you are most kind," and she meant none of it. He took her cameo brooch as security against the room, the small brooch that had been her grandmother's, the one she had pinned at her collar that morning as she stepped off the stage. He said it was a formality just for the books, just so that everything was proper and businesslike. She unpinned it with steady hands and she gave it to him, and she watched him drop it into the tin box behind the counter. She did not give him the ring. The ring was still in the hem of her dress. The ring she would have died before giving him, although she did not know yet standing there in the mercantile exactly why. That night she lay on the narrow bed in the room above the store and she did not sleep. The walls were thin. The floor between her room and the back office of the store below was thinner still, and she could hear when she lay very still on the boards beside the bed, with her ear pressed to the gap, the murmur of voices from below. It was Mercer, and another man whose voice she did not know. They had come into the back office after the store had closed, and they were drinking from a bottle, and they were speaking the way men speak when they think no woman in the world can hear them. All 3 of them. Hollister's is alive and well, but that mountain, Mercer was saying, and his voice was nothing like the warm, sorrowful voice of the afternoon. It was flat, and it was satisfied, and it had a small, private laugh moving around inside it. Telling her the eldest is dead is enough to keep her down here while the storm sets in. I keep her here 3 days, maybe 4. Take what she has on her. Then Brennan rides her up to Helena and we put her on the books. Boston girls always bring a price. Virgin and educated. Brennan will give us 400 easy. Maybe more if the buyer in Helena is the one I think he is. The other man laughed. The other man said something Della did not catch about the snow being a blessing this time. Della did not move. She did not breathe. She lay on the cold board floor of the room above the mercantile, and she felt her own heart beating against the wood, and the small, clear part of her that did not panic was already awake and at work. It was already counting her assets. A carpet bag, a wool shawl, the ring in her hem, a pair of leather boots that had not yet rotted through, a mind that knew how to read a ledger and now also knew how to read a man. She had until perhaps the third night before Brennan came for her from Helena. She had until perhaps the second night before Mercer found a reason to take the carpet bag. She had until the storm thickened enough to close every road out of Silver Creek that did not lead up the mountain, and the road up the mountain was the only road Mercer did not want her to take, which meant it was the only road she had left. Della Ashford lay on the floor of that little room with her ear to the boards until the voices below stopped and the lamp downstairs went out. Then she got up and she put on her boots and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and she made her plan. She would leave on the second night, not the first, because the first night they would still be expecting her to try. She would steal a coat from the lean-to behind the store because her own shawl would not get her past the timberline. She would take a heel of bread from the kitchen and a strip of dried meat if she could find one. She would walk out the back, not the front, and she would follow the creek north, not south, the way the old laundry woman who came to wash sheets that morning had whispered to her in the kitchen passage as she pretended to rinse her hands. Follow the Silver Creek north, the laundry woman had said in a voice barely above breath, as if she had seen this script play out before in this town and could not bear to see it played again. Past 3 hills, past the broken pine, then turn left. Do not go after dark. The Hollister boys is hard men, but they is honest men, and they will not turn a woman out. The laundry woman had not waited for thanks. She had taken her basket and she had left through the side door with her head down. Della had understood in the moment that she had been given a key. The key did not promise a door, but it promised at least the existence of a door. 2 nights later, in the small hours of the morning of December 18th, when the wind off the mountain was loud enough to cover the small sounds of a girl moving in the dark, Adelaide Ashford slipped out the back of Mercer Mercantile with a stolen coat over her shoulders and a heel of black bread in her pocket and her carpet bag left behind on the bed because the carpet bag would slow her down. She had the ring in her hem. She had the boots on her feet. She had nothing else in the world. The storm, which the laundry woman had said would come by the second day, came by the 6th hour. It came down off the Bitterroot Range in a single dropping wall of white. And inside 2 hours, Della had lost the line of the creek, and inside 4, she had lost any clear sense of which way was north. And inside 6, she was no longer walking so much as falling forward and catching herself, while the cold worked its way up through the leather of her boots and into the marrow of her shins. She fell once and did not get up for some long time. When she got up, she did not remember why she was getting up. She fell again later, and she could not say how much later. And when she got up the second time, it was because she had thought with great clarity of Etta sleeping in the bed in Boston with her hand under her cheek. And she had remembered that she had sworn an oath on her father, and she had decided that she was not going to let an oath sworn on Edmund Ashford be broken in a snowdrift in Montana while there was still one breath in her body to keep walking. She walked, and she walked. And on the third afternoon of her walking, when her body had stopped feeling like her body and her mind had begun to lie down somewhere quiet and warm, she came up out of the timber into a windswept clearing, and she saw the thread of smoke against the iron sky, and she saw the cabin under the smoke, and she took the ring from her hem, and she made her last 100 yards. You know what she said when she got there? You know what she held out in her open palm? What you do not know yet, what Della Ashford herself did not know, as she sank to her knees on the porch boards of the Hollister cabin, was that the tall man who had come out of that door with his face going pale at the sight of her, the man whose name she had been told 2 days ago was a dead man buried in a churchyard in Silver Creek, was Silas Hollister himself, alive, 33 years old, builder of the cabin behind him. Eldest of 3 brothers, author of the letter that had carried her west, the man who had written, "I do not live alone," and meant by it that he had 2 brothers under his roof, and meant by it also, Although he had not known he meant it, that he had been so alone for so many years that the word alone had begun to feel like the only word that could describe him, and the word not alone had begun to feel like a kind of prayer. She came back to herself by inches. The first thing she knew was warmth. Real warmth, the kind that goes into the bones and not just the skin. The warmth of a quilt that smelled of cedar shavings and wood smoke. The warmth of a stone hearth somewhere close by, throwing its heat across the floorboards and up the side of the bed where she lay. She did not open her eyes for a long time. She was afraid that if she opened her eyes, the warmth would prove to be a dream and she would still be in the snow. When she did open them, she saw a low ceiling of dark beams. She saw an oil lamp turned low on a small table beside the bed. She saw on the table a tin cup of water and a spoon and a folded square of clean cloth. She saw on the back of a chair pulled up to the bed, but pulled back to a respectful distance, a heavy wool coat that did not belong to her. And she saw sitting in the chair the man with the chestnut hair and the whiskey-colored eyes, his elbows on his knees, his great scarred hands hanging loose between them, his face turned toward the fire so that she could see only the line of his jaw and the so steady rise and fall of his shoulders. He had not slept. She could tell that without asking. The way his shoulders sat said he had not slept since they had brought her in. She tried to speak. The first try made no sound. The second try was a whisper. "You are not dead." The man's head turned. Slowly, like a man turning towards a sound he has been waiting a very long time to hear. His voice when it came was low and rough at the edges and careful. The careful of a man who knew his own voice was a heavy thing and did not want to drop it on someone fragile. "No, ma'am," he said. "I am not dead. My name is Silas Hollister. I am the man who wrote you the letter. And whoever told you otherwise is a man you and I are going to have a word about by and by." Della closed her eyes again, not because she was tired, although she was. She closed them because the tears were coming and she did not want him to see them. Not yet. Not before she had taken the measure of him. Not before she knew whether the kindness in his voice was the real kind or the Mercer kind. She had learned in the room above the mercantile that kindness in a man's voice was the most dangerous lie a woman could believe. But the tears came anyway. They came hot and silent down the sides of her face into the cedar-smelling pillow, and she did not make a sound. And when at last she opened her eyes again, Silas Hollister was still sitting in the chair where he had been sitting, and he had not moved closer and he had not looked away. He had simply waited. He had the patient waiting of a man who had spent a great deal of his life with horses and with weather and with grief. "There is a stew on the fire," he said quietly. "When you are ready, not before. Tobias is in the kitchen. Red has gone out to bring in more wood. Nobody is going to come into this room except me, and I will not come closer than this chair until you tell me I may. You are safe in this house, Miss Ashford. I know that is a word that has been used on you lately by a man who did not mean it. I am telling you the word the way I mean it. You are safe in this house. You are going to stay safe in this house. And by, when you are strong enough, you and I are going to talk about a man named Mercer." Della did not answer right away. She lay on the cedar pillow and she watched the firelight move on the dark beams of the ceiling, and she felt the gold ring of her mother in her closed left fist, where someone, Silas himself, she would learn later, had pressed it back into her hand after they had carried her in from the porch. He had not kept the ring. He had not even set it on the table beside the bed. He had put it back into her hand and closed her fingers around it, because he had understood without being told that the ring was the last piece of love she owned in the world, and that a starving woman who has been offered a ring in trade for a meal is a woman whose dignity hangs by a thread, and that thread must not be cut. Outside the cabin, the wind off the Bitterroot Range was rising into the long night of December 18th. Down in the valley in the back office of Mercer Mercantile, Cyrus Mercer was discovering that the bed in the room above the store was empty, that the carpet bag had been left behind, and that the Boston girl had vanished into a storm no one in her right mind would walk into. He was not going to leave it there. He had paid no attention yet to where she might have gone, because in his mind there was only one direction a starving woman could possibly walk in such a storm, and that direction was down the road back to the train. He would learn his mistake in the morning, and when he learned it, he would saddle his horse, and he would take two men with him, and he would ride for the only place on the mountain a desperate woman might have made it to alive. But all of that was for tomorrow. Tonight, Della Ashford lay in a cedar-smelling bed under a quilt that did not belong to her, in a cabin she had been told did not contain a living man. And she watched the firelight on the ceiling, and she listened to the slow, steady breathing of the chestnut-haired man in the chair by the bed. And she understood with the same cold, clear part of her that had understood everything else one new thing. She had not come to the end of the road. She had only come to the beginning of it. The first morning Della Ashford woke in the Hollister cabin, she did not know for almost a full minute where she was. She lay very still under the cedar-smelling quilt, and she listened. There was a fire popping somewhere, the slow, regular pop of pine resin in a banked hearth. There was the smell of coffee, real coffee, the dark good kind, the kind her father had bought once a month from the Italian importer on Hanover Street. There was a low murmur of men's voices in another room. Two voices, one deeper than the other, both careful, both held down to a volume that suggested they knew there was a sleeping woman in the house, and they were trying not to wake her. She opened her eyes by degrees. The room was small and clean, pine boards on the floor scrubbed pale by years of soap and sand, a washstand against one wall with a tin basin and a folded gray towel. A single small window with the shutter half open, and through the half-open shutter she could see that the storm had stopped sometime in the night, and the world outside was the kind of blinding white that hurts the back of the eye. There were no curtains. There was no mirror. There was a chair pulled up to the bed, and the chair was empty, but on the seat of the chair lay a folded gray dress that was not hers, and beside the dress lay a pair of thick wool stockings, and on top of the stockings sat the heavy wool coat she had seen on the chair the night before. She understood, looking at the clothing, that some hand had set them there in the dark hours while she slept. Set them there and gone. Set them there and not lingered, because the man who had set them there had known that a woman waking in a stranger's house must wake without a stranger looking at her. She sat up, slowly. Every muscle in her body hurt in a clean, honest way, the way muscles hurt after they have been used past their limit and have come back from it. Her hands were wrapped in clean white linen. She did not remember anyone wrapping them. There was a small clay pot on the table beside the bed with the smell of tallow and herbs in it, the smell of a salve that had been made by hand from a recipe somebody's mother had known. She got dressed in the gray dress slowly. It was too big in the shoulders, and it had been washed many times, but it was clean and warm, and it smelled of cedar, like the quilt. She did not put on the coat. She put on the stockings, and she put her feet down on the cold pine boards, and she found that her legs would hold her just barely. And she walked to the door of the small room, and she opened it. The cabin opened up on the other side of that door into one long room with a great stone hearth at the far end, and a heavy plank table down the middle, and a kitchen in the corner closest to her where a black cast-iron stove threw its heat into the air, and a coffee pot sat steaming on the back of it. The ceiling was high. The beams were the size of a man's thigh. There were elk antlers above the door and a long row of cast-iron pans hanging from pegs on the wall, and in the far corner near the hearth, there was a bookshelf, an actual bookshelf with maybe 40 books on it, leather spines that had been read until the gold of the titles had worn off. There were 3 men in the room, and all 3 of them stopped what they were doing when she came through the door. Silas stood up from the bench where he had been sitting at the table. He was even taller standing in the daylight than he had been in the firelight, and the daylight showed her things the firelight had hidden. The lines around his mouth that came from years of squinting into wind. The small white scar through his left eyebrow. The way his chestnut hair was cut blunt at the collar, the way a man cuts his own hair with a hunting knife when there is no woman in the house to do it for him. He was wearing a clean blue shirt and dark trousers, and his suspenders were down off his shoulders, and looped at his hips, and his big scarred hands were holding a coffee cup that looked like a child's toy in his fingers. The second brother, the one who had caught her on the porch, stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in his hand. He was broader through the chest than Silas, if that was possible, and his hair was a touch lighter, the color of dark honey, and his eyes were the same whiskey amber as his elder brother's. He did not smile when she came in. He inclined his head once gravely, the way a man inclines his head to a woman in church, and he turned back to the stove to give her the privacy of not being looked at while she crossed the room. The third brother, the youngest, was sitting on the hearthstone with his elbows on his knees, mending something in his lap with a length of leather and an awl. He looked up and grinned at her. It was a quick, honest grin, and it was the first thing in the cabin that did not feel careful. "Morning, ma'am," the youngest said. "You walk good. We thought you might not be up till tomorrow. Toby's got biscuits in the warming drawer if you can stomach them." "My brother Rhett," Silas said in his low, careful voice, "and my brother Tobias. We call him Toby. Miss Ashford, please. Sit. There is no hurry." Della sat. She sat in the chair Silas pulled out for her at the head of the long plank table, and she folded her bandaged hands in her lap because she did not yet know what to do with them. And she watched Toby pour coffee into a tin cup and bring it to her and set it down without his fingers ever once brushing hers. He set down a plate with 2 biscuits and a pat of yellow butter and a small jar of dark honey. He set down a spoon. He stepped back. None of these 3 men, she realized slowly, had come within arm's length of her since she had walked out of the bedroom. They were giving her the entire width of the cabin. They were doing it without making a show of doing it. She picked up the coffee cup with both bandaged hands. The first sip went into her like sunlight. "Thank you," she said. Silas sat down at the far end of the table, 3 chairs away. He did not pick up his own cup again. He set his hands flat on the wood, and he looked at her in the steady, patient way he had looked at her in the chair by the bed the night before. "Miss Ashford, there are things we need to say to each other. Some of them can wait, some cannot. The ones that cannot, I will say first, and then I will leave you to your breakfast." "All right," Della said. "My name is Silas Hollister. I am 33 years old. I built this cabin with my brothers 10 years ago after our father died down in Missouri, and we came west. I run a little over 200 head of cattle on the South Meadows. Toby is my middle brother. He keeps the forge, and most of the ironwork in the valley comes through him. Red is the youngest, and he is the best tracker in the Bitterroot, although I would prefer you do not tell him I said so. We are not rich men in the way the East counts riches, but we are not poor men either. There is enough in this house for the 4 of us to winter through and never feel the pinch of it." He paused. He looked at his hands a moment, then back at her. "I wrote you a letter in October. I wrote it because I am 33 years old, and I have lived alone on this mountain for 8 years, and I had begun to understand that a man can carry a thing only so far by himself before the thing starts to carry him. I wrote it because Toby and Rhett told me I was becoming a stone, and because I knew they were right, and because I had read in a Helena paper that there were honest women back east who had come to the end of the world they were born into and were looking for a different one. I wrote the letter and I sent it, and I expected nothing. Most men in my situation get nothing. Then I got your letter back, and I read it 3 times, and I decided. I sent the funds, I sent the date of the coach. I told you I would meet it, and I meant to meet it." He stopped again. Something moved in his jaw. "I was at the coach on the 15th of December. I was there 3 hours before the coach was due, and I waited 4 hours after. The stage came and went, and there was no woman on it. There was a Methodist preacher and 2 men I know, and the driver told me there had been 1 woman, a young woman in a Navy traveling dress, and she had gotten down at Mercer Mercantile, and she had not come back out. I went to Mercer's that afternoon. Mercer told me he had not seen any woman of any description. Mercer looked me in the eye, and he told me that, and I had no reason then to call him a liar. I rode back up this mountain on the 16th, thinking the woman who had written me the letter had changed her mind in Cheyenne and gotten back on the train east, and I told my brothers as much, and I told myself I would not write again. And then on the 18th, in the middle of a storm, I would not have walked a dog into you came up out of the timber with this cabin's chimney smoke at your back. Della set down the coffee cup. He told me you were dead, she said. I know he did. We figured that out by the look on your face when I told you my name. He said there had been an accident on the high pasture. He said you had been buried in the churchyard on the 3rd. Silas's mouth made the smallest movement at one corner. It was not a smile. It was the shape a man's mouth makes when he is filing a thing away to be answered later. Mercer is going to wish very much by and by that he had not said that. He took my brooch, Della said. He said it was security against the room. He said he would help me get back to Boston. He put me in a room above the store, and he locked it from the outside the second night, although he made it look as if he was only checking the bolt. Yeah, I heard him through the floor with another man. He said that they would keep me 3 days, and then a man named Brennan would ride me up to Helena, and there would be buyers there. He said Boston girls always brought a price. She did not know until she had said the words how hard it was going to be to say them. She had to look down at the table when she said the last sentence because her face was getting hot, and she had decided long ago that she was not going to weep in front of these men any more than she had already wept in front of them last night without being able to help it. When she looked up, the room had gone very still. Toby had stopped moving at the stove. His big back was very straight. The wooden spoon in his hand had stopped stirring. Rhett on the hearthstone had set down the leather in the awl, and his quick, young face had gone hard in a way that made him look a great deal older than the boy who had grinned at her 2 minutes before. Silas had not moved at all. He sat exactly the way he had been sitting, hands flat on the wood eyes on her face. But something had happened behind his eyes, the way weather happens behind a ridge, slow at first and then all at once. And Della understood, looking at him, that she was sitting at a table with a man who had just made a decision he was not going to walk back from. He spoke gently. The gentleness was for her. The thing under the gentleness was not for her at all. You are safe in this house, Miss Ashford. I told you that last night. I am telling you again now in the daylight so you can hear me say it sober. Cyrus Mercer is not going to touch you. Brennan from Helena is not going to touch you. Any man in this valley who has thought of touching you is going to learn this winter that he was mistaken. Do you understand me? Yes. Good. The second thing, the arrangement I wrote about in the letter, I am going to set that aside for now. I do not know what kind of woman you are, and you do not know what kind of man I am, and a contract written between strangers in October cannot be enforced in December by a man who has just learned what you have just told me. So here is the new arrangement. You take the room you slept in last night. That is your room. I sleep in the loft with my brothers from now until the spring thaw. There is no obligation in this house beyond food and a roof and the use of the fire. You eat what we eat. You rest until you are mended. When you are mended, if you wish to work for your keep, there is plenty of work, and Toby will show you what is useful and what is not. And Rhett will take you out on the ranch when the weather allows it, if you would like to learn the country. When the spring thaw comes, the road down to Silver Creek opens, and from Silver Creek, the road east opens. If on that day you wish to leave, I will pay your passage to Boston or to anywhere else in this country you would like to go, and I will not ask you for 1 penny back, and I will not ask you for one promise. If on that day you wish to stay, then we will have a different conversation. But the conversation does not happen until the thaw. Are these terms acceptable to you, Miss Ashford? Della sat with the coffee cup in her bandaged hands, and she looked at the man at the far end of the table, and something in her chest that had been wound up tight as a watch spring for 6 weeks let go one full turn. Yes, Mr. Hollister, they are acceptable. Silas, in this house, if you can manage it. Silas, eat your breakfast, Della Ashford. Toby makes the best biscuits in the territory, and he likes to be told so. The biscuit broke open under her thumb in a hot, soft cloud of steam, and she put butter in it, and she put honey on the butter, and she ate. And while she ate, the cabin around her went back to its slow, careful quiet, and Toby went back to the stove, and Rhett picked up the leather in the awl, and Silas sat at the far end of the table and watched the fire and did not look at her again until she had finished her plate, because he had been raised by a mother who had taught him that a hungry person should be allowed to eat without an audience. In this way, the first morning passed. The first week of Della Ashford in the Hollister cabin was a week of small, careful kindnesses, none of them spoken. She woke each morning to find that someone had brought a fresh basin of warm water to the washstand outside her door, and a fresh small cake of soap and a clean towel, and that the someone had then withdrawn to the far end of the cabin so that she could come out and wash without being seen. She came to understand by the third day that the someone was always Tobias. Toby rose before any of them, before the coldest gray of dawn, and he laid the fires, and he set the coffee, and he carried the water in from this well behind the cabin, and he heated it on the stove, and he carried it to her door, and he did all of this without ever once making the noise that would have allowed her to thank him for it. She thanked him anyway on the fourth morning when she came out of her room and found him at the stove and the water already on the washstand. She said only, "Thank you, Toby." He inclined his head the same grave half-inch he had inclined it the first morning. He said, "Ma'am." He turned back to the stove. The tips of his ears, she saw, were red. Rhett was the one who made her laugh first. It happened on the fifth day. She had walked slow and careful out onto the front porch in her gray dress, in the heavy wool coat that turned out to belong to Silas because the coat was the only one in the cabin big enough to swallow her down to the knees and keep the wind off her ankles. She had gone out because the cabin air had begun to feel close to her, and because she wanted to see in the daylight at the country she had walked through to get here. She was standing at the porch rail with her bandaged hands tucked into the pockets of the coat when Rhett came around the corner of the cabin from the direction of the barn, leading a small, shaggy bay horse on a halter, and behind the bay horse came a yellow dog of no determinable breed, and behind the yellow dog came a half-grown calf that did not appear to belong to either the horse or the dog, but had attached itself to the procession out of pure social interest. Rhett saw her on the porch, and he stopped, and the bay horse stopped, and the yellow dog sat down in the snow, and the half-grown calf walked into the back of the dog and let out a small, surprised noise. Rhett looked at the calf. He looked at Della. He looked back at the calf. He shook his head once, the slow, regretful head shake of a man whose life is a procession of unwanted livestock. "Ma'am," he called up to her, "I want you to know that this calf has followed me to and from the barn every morning for 2 weeks, and I have given up trying to teach him otherwise. I am introducing you to him formally, so that when he eats your laundry off the line in April, you will know who to blame." Della heard a sound come out of her mouth that she had not heard in a long time. It was a small, surprised laugh. It surprised her as much as it surprised the calf. Rhett saw it land on her face, and he grinned the same quick, honest grin she had seen the first morning, and he tipped his hat to her, an exaggerated gentleman's tip, and he led the procession on around the side of the cabin and out of sight, and Della stood at the porch rail with the laugh still warming the back of her throat. And she thought, oh, so I can still do that. The cabin held more than she had understood at first. She came to learn it room by room in the slow exploring way of a woman who has been told the house is hers for the winter and wants to know what the house contains. There was the great main room with the hearth and the table in the kitchen. There was her bedroom off one side of it, and a second, smaller bedroom off the other side, which she would learn later had been Silas's room when he had slept down here, and which was empty now because Silas had moved his things up to the loft the morning after she arrived, the way he had said he would. There was the loft itself, reached by a ladder, which she did not climb because the loft was the men's quarters now, and a woman did not climb into men's quarters in 1878, even when she had been told the house was hers. There was a back porch with a smokehouse off it and a row of hams hanging in the dark like dark lanterns. There was the forge, in a separate small building of its own with a tin roof and a brick chimney, where Toby spent 4 hours of every day, and she could hear from the cabin the slow, steady ringing of his hammer on the anvil, a sound like a heart that was somebody else's and was beating for the whole valley. There was the bookshelf. She came to it on the seventh day when her bandaged hands had begun to itch under their wrappings and she was beginning to feel useful again, rather than only fragile. She walked to the shelf and she ran her eyes along the spines. There was a leather Bible, well used. There was a copy of Plutarch's Lives in 2 volumes that had been mended at the spine with sinew. There was a copy of Walden. There was Pilgrim's Progress. There was a thick book on horse husbandry and a thinner one on the diseases of cattle, and a folio of Shakespeare's tragedies that had been read so many times the pages had gone the color of weak tea. There were 3 volumes of Sir Walter Scott and a battered copy of Last of the Mohicans, and on the bottom shelf, where a man might keep the books he was not entirely sure he wanted other men to see him keeping, there was a slim volume of the poems of Robert Burns, and another even slimmer of the poems of a woman named Elizabeth Browning. Della stood in front of the shelf for a long time. A man who kept Elizabeth Browning on his bottom shelf was not a man she had been prepared to find on the Bitterroot Range. She turned and saw across the room that Silas was watching her from the table where he had been cleaning a rifle. He had not made a sound. He had simply looked up, and his face when she met his eyes was the careful, unreadable face of a man who had been caught at something he was not ashamed of, but had not expected to be caught at. "My mother's books," he said. "She brought them west in a wagon in 1854. The Burns and the Browning are hers. I have not read them for some years. You may take any of them that pleases you to your room if you would like to read in the evenings." "Thank you," Della said. She took down the Browning. She did not say anything more about it, and neither did he, but that night by the fire after supper, when the dishes had been cleared and Toby had gone out to the forge to bank his coals for the night, and Rhett had taken the yellow dog out to walk the perimeter of the corral the way he did every night before bed. Della sat in the rocking chair near the hearth with the small book open in her bandaged hands, and Silas sat in the chair across from her with a piece of harness leather across his knee and an awl in his hand, and neither of them said a word for almost an hour. And the silence was not the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of 2 people who were sharing a fire and were content to share it. Sometime after the 2nd hour, when the fire had burned down to red coals, and Della had read Sonnet 43, for the 3rd time she closed the book softly on her thumb, and she said into the quiet Silas, "May I ask you a question?" "You may. You said in the letter that you did not live alone. You meant your brothers. I meant my brothers. Did you mean anything else?" The question hung in the air between them for a long moment. Silas did not look up from the harness leather right away. When he did look up, his face had the look it had worn that first morning when she had told him about Mercer through the floorboards. "There was a woman," he said, "8 years ago. Her name was Lenora. She came west on a wagon train in the spring of 1869. She was 24 years old. She had answered an advertisement in a Pittsburgh paper that I had not written, but a friend of mine in Helena had written for me, because in those days I did not know how to write such a letter for myself. She came to Silver Creek the way you came to Silver Creek. She rode up this mountain on a borrowed mule the way you walked up this mountain in a storm. We were married that May by a circuit preacher who came through the valley once a year. In the autumn of 1870, she was carrying our child. In the December of 1870, a storm came down off the range, and I was at the south fence line a long way from the cabin, and Lenore went into her labor early, and she went out into the snow to find me because Toby and Rhett were both away on a hunt, and she was alone in the cabin. They found her 2 days later, half a mile from the porch. She had not made it past the broken pine on the trail. He did not look at Della while he said it. He looked at the harness leather. His big hands moved on the awl with the steady patience of a man who needed to be doing something with his hands while his mouth said the words. "For 8 years I have believed I killed her. I have believed that if I had been at the cabin, if I had not been at the south fence, if I had heard her call my name, she would not have walked into that snow. I have believed it the way a man believes a Sunday sermon. I have believed it so long it has become the shape of who I am. That is the thing I meant when I said in the letter that I did not live alone. I did not mean my brothers. I meant her. I meant the 8 years she has been walking out into that snow inside my head. I did not know I meant it when I wrote it. I know it now. Della did not move from the rocking chair. She did not reach across the space between them because the space between them was the space he had set, and she would not cross it without his asking. But she set the small book of Browning down very gently on the arm of the chair, and she said quietly into the warm red dark of the dying fire, Silas Hollister, I am very sorry for your Lenora, and I want you to hear me when I say this. A man who walks out to the south fence in the morning is not a man who killed his wife. He is a man who was working. He is a man who was doing the thing that fed her and the child she was carrying. The storm killed her. The early labor killed her. The distance killed her. The country killed her. You did not kill her. I do not have the right to tell you that because I did not know her and I have only known you for a week. But I have read enough ledgers in my life to know an honest accounting from a false one. And the one you have been keeping in your head for 8 years is a false one. And I think somewhere underneath it, you have always known that. And I think the reason you could not write that letter for yourself in 1869 and could write one in October of this year is that some small voice in you had finally begun to ask whether the accounting was right. Silas Hollister did not look up from the harness leather for a long moment. When he did look up, his whiskey-colored eyes were wet at the inside corners, the way a man's eyes get wet when he is too proud to let the tears fall, but cannot stop them gathering. He said very quietly, "Thank you, Della." It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it. Della picked up the small book of Browning again, and she did not say anything more because she understood that what had been said was enough and that anything said on top of it would be too much. The fire popped softly in the hearth. Outside, the wind off the Bitterroot Range was rising again into a long, the sigh of a winter that had decided to stay a while. The next morning, Della asked to be useful. She asked Toby first because Toby was at the kitchen end of the cabin, and because the kitchen was the one place in the house where a Boston girl who had never roped a steer might claim the right to know what she was about. Toby looked at her gravely over the top of a sack of cornmeal. He set the sack down. He said, "Ma'am, my biscuits are good, but I will tell you the truth. My bread is only fair, and a winter is a long time to eat only fair bread." Della said, "My mother taught me to bake." Toby said, "Then this kitchen is yours when you want it, and I will be the first man at this table to thank you for it." He said it the same grave half-inch of the head he gave her every morning, and he meant every word. By the end of the second week, Della Ashford had washed her navy blue traveling dress, mended the torn hem, and stitched her mother's oral ring back inside the lining where it had ridden west with her from Boston. And she was baking bread 3 times a week in the great cast-iron stove of the Hollister cabin. The bread came out brown and high and good, and the smell of it filled the long main room from the rafters to the pine-board floor. And on the first day, she pulled a loaf from the oven and turned it out onto the cooling rack. Rhett came in from the cold and stopped in the doorway and breathed in the smell of it with his eyes closed like a man stepping into a church. "Ma'am," he said, "if you stay through Christmas, I will marry that bread," Rhett Silas said from the table without looking up. "I know, Silas. I know. I'm only saying." The bread. Della did not laugh out loud, but she turned to the cooling rack with her face down so that Rhett would not see her smiling, and she let the smile happen on her face for a long moment in the dim warmth above the loaves, and she understood that something in her was beginning to mend. It was on the morning of the 15th day that Della Ashford walked into the small office at the back of the cabin and saw for the first time the green ledger. She had not gone looking for it. She had been carrying a stack of clean folded shirts to put away in the small chest at the foot of Silas's old bed in the empty downstairs bedroom because Toby had washed the men's clothes the day before, and Della had taken over the folding because folding was something her bandaged hands could finally manage. She had pushed open the door of the small office to set the shirts on the chest, and she had seen on the desk by the window a great green leather book with a brass corner clasp lying open at a page covered in a square, firm hand she now knew to be Silas's. She set the shirts down on the chest. She walked very slowly to the desk. She did not touch the ledger. She only looked at it. Her father had taught her when she was 15 years old that a ledger could be read the way a doctor reads a face. You did not need to add the columns. You did not need to know the names of the accounts. You only needed to look at the shape of the numbers and the rhythm of the entries, the way a doctor looks at the color of a man's skin and the rhythm of his breath. And the ledger would tell you whether it was a healthy ledger or a sick one before you ever picked up a pen. The ledger on Silas Hollister's desk was a sick ledger. She saw it in 3 seconds. She saw it in the rhythm of the entries on the open page. The Hollister Ranch was a healthy ranch. She had been here long enough to know that. There were 212 head of cattle on the South Meadows. There was a small silver claim on the back of the mountain that ran a steady trickle of bullion through the assay office in Helena every quarter. There was a flow of ironwork from Toby's forge that paid in coin every month. The Hollister Ranch should have been a ranch with a comfortable balance and a steady upward line. The ledger on the desk did not show a comfortable balance. The ledger on the desk showed a ranch that had been bleeding money for 8 years through a small, hidden seam, the kind of seam Edmund Ashford had taught his daughter to look for in the back office of the South End store. Small entries that did not match the seasons. A column of fees called handling that no honest banker called handling on a healthy account. The ledger was being skimmed. It was being skimmed by a man who had been skimming it for a very long time and had grown lazy about hiding his tracks because the man who owned the ledger had never once looked at the columns the way a man looks at his own face in a mirror. Della stood in the office of Silas Hollister with the cold winter light coming through the window and falling on the green leather of the book, and she felt the small, hard knot in her chest that she had felt the night she had stood on the back stairs of the house on Beacon Street. She felt it because she understood with the same cold clarity she had understood Pierce that night exactly whose theft was hidden inside the credit column of the Hollister ledger. She did not need to see a name. The pattern itself was the name. There was only one banker in Silver Creek who handled the Hollister accounts. There was only one man in the valley who had told her with a fatherly smile that Silas Hollister was dead and buried in a churchyard. The thief inside the ledger was Cyrus Mercer. Della Ashford set the stack of clean folded shirts down on the chest at the foot of the bed. She walked back to the desk. She did not touch the ledger. She only stood and looked at it for a full minute, while the slow ringing of Toby's hammer came in from the forge across the yard, a steady iron heartbeat through the cold morning air. Then she turned and she walked out of the office, and she pulled the door very softly closed behind her, because she had not yet decided how she was going to tell Silas Hollister that the man who had told her he was dead was the same man who had been killing his ranch by inches for 8 years, and she needed time to choose her words. She walked back through the long main room of the cabin. She saw Silas at the far end of the table, pulling the lock of a long gun with a square of soft cloth. She saw the shape of his shoulders bent over the work, and she thought not yet. Not in the morning. Not while Toby's hammer was ringing in the yard, and Rhett was somewhere in the South Corral with the bay horse and the yellow dog. Not until evening. Not until the fire was low and the words could be set down between two people who were already in the habit of sharing a fire. She took up the small Browning from the arm of the rocking chair where she had left it the night before, and she carried it back to her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed with the book closed in her bandaged hands, and she waited. She waited the whole long winter morning. She helped Toby knead the dough for the day's loaves because helping with bread was the kind of work that did not require talking and did not show in her face. She carried in stove wood from the side porch by the armful, slow and careful, because her hands were still tender under their wrappings. She set the table for the noon meal. She drank a cup of coffee at the corner of the long plank table while the three brothers ate, and she listened to Rhett tell a story about a marten he had seen in a snare that morning that had looked at him, he said, like a Methodist preacher who had caught a deacon stealing from the collection plate, and she made her face do the small smile the story deserved. But all the while in the back of her mind, the column of false entries on Silas Hollister's desk was running its cold, quiet line under everything. It was not until the early dark of the December afternoon, When Toby had gone back out to the forge to finish a pair of horseshoes for a neighbor 4 miles down the valley, and Red had gone with him to hold the off-hind in the cabin had emptied of all sound except the pop of the hearth, that she came out of her room and walked the length of the main room and stopped at the head of the long table where Silas was now writing a letter in his square, firm hand by the light of the oil lamp. He looked up. He set down the pen. Della. Silas, may I sit? You may sit anywhere in this house you please, you know that. She sat, not at the far end of the table where she had sat that first morning, but in the chair at the corner nearest to him, close enough that she could see the small cracks in the leather of his elbow where he had set it on the wood. Silas, I was carrying clean shirts into the small bedroom this morning, and the door of your office was open, and your green ledger was lying on the desk. It was. I had been at it before breakfast. I did not touch it. I want you to know that. I did not turn a page. I only looked at it from where I was standing. But I looked at it long enough to see something, and I have spent the day deciding whether I had the right to tell you what I saw, and I have decided that I do not have the right to keep it from you, and so I am going to tell you now, and you may do with it what you wish. Silas Hollister put both his hands flat on the table the way he had put them on the table that first morning. All right, Silas, when I was 15 years old, my father took me into the back office of his dry goods store in Boston, and he sat me down at his desk, and he opened the great green ledger of the store on the desk in front of me, and he taught me how to read it. He taught me on every Saturday for 4 years. He taught me to keep books. He taught me to find a theft inside a column of ones. He taught me that a woman who could read a ledger was a woman who could not be cheated. He told me the last winter of his life that there was no skill in the world he was prouder to have given me. I did not put any of this in the letter I sent you in October. I did not put it in the letter because my father also taught me never to show all the cards in your hand to a man you have not yet sat down with. I am sitting down with you now, and so I am showing you the card. She watched his face while she said it. He did not interrupt. He only listened the way he had listened in the chair beside her bed the night she had come out of the snow. I read the page of your ledger that was open this morning. I did not need to read more than the page. The page was enough. Silas, your ranch is not the ranch your ledger shows. Your ranch should be a ranch with 212 head of cattle and a steady silver claim and a forge that pays in coin every month and a comfortable upward line at the bottom of every column. Your ranch is a ranch with all of those things. Your ledger is not. Your ledger is the ledger of a ranch that has been bleeding money in a small, slow seam for at least 8 years, and the seam is being opened from the outside by a man who knows where to put a knife into a column without leaving fingerprints, except that this particular man has grown lazy because the man who owns the ledger has never once looked at it the way a man looks at his own face in a mirror. There are entries in the credit column that match no goods you took delivery of in the season they were entered. There are charges called handling that no honest banker calls handling. There are small fees against the silver assays that should not be there at all. I cannot tell you the exact total without going through the book page by page with your permission. I can tell you sitting here without ever having added a single line of it that the total is not small. I would guess, knowing what a sick ledger looks like and knowing that this kind of theft starts small and grows bold the longer it goes unpunished, that the total across 8 years is somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. Silas had not moved. Della. I am almost done, Silas. I have to say the last thing, and the last thing is the hardest thing, and I have to say it before I lose the courage. The man who has been opening that small, slow seam in your accounts for 8 years is the only banker in Silver Creek who handles the Hollister accounts. He is the man who told me on the 15th of December that you were dead and buried in the churchyard. He is Cyrus Mercer. I cannot prove it without your permission to read the book. But I knew it the moment I saw the page, and I have known it all morning, and I am telling you now because you are a man who deserves to know what is being done in his own house, under his own roof, and against his own brothers. And I would rather you be angry with me for telling you than carry the knowing alone for one more day. The cabin was very quiet. The fire popped twice in the hearth. Outside, the slow ringing of the hammer in the forge had stopped because Toby had finished the second shoe and was banking his coals for the night. Della heard her own breath in the quiet, and she heard the slow heartbeat in her ears, and she did not look away from Silas Hollister's face. He looked down at his hands on the table for a long moment. He looked at the lamp. He looked at the green ink bottle next to the lamp. He looked finally at her. Della Ashford, he said in a voice she had not heard from him before, low and even, and without any softness in it at all. You have my permission. You have it tonight. You take that ledger out of the office and you bring it to this table, and you read every page of it from the autumn of 1870 to the present. You take whatever paper you need and whatever time you need and whatever quiet you need, and you find me the number and the names of the entries and the dates. I will sit at the other end of this table while you do it, and I will not speak unless you ask me to, and I will not look over your shoulder, because what is happening at this table tonight is the thing my father tried to teach me to do for myself when I was a boy, and I was too restless to learn. You will do it instead, and I will be in your debt for the rest of my life for the doing of it. He stood up. He walked the length of the cabin to the office door. He came back with the green leather book under one arm and a stack of foolscap paper and his own pen and the bottle of ink, and he set them down at the corner of the table where she was sitting, and he turned the lamp up one notch so that the light fell clean and yellow across the page, and he walked to the far end of the table and he sat down in his own chair, and he folded his arms, and he watched the fire, and he did not move. Della opened the ledger. She turned very carefully to the first page of the autumn of 1870. The page was 8 years old. The ink had aged into a soft brown, the way old ink does in a dry mountain cabin where the air does not eat the iron out of the gall. She took up Silas Hollister's pen. She dipped it. She set the first sheet of foolscap beside the open page, and she began to read. She read for 2 hours. Toby and Rhett came in from the forge somewhere in the first hour, and they saw her at the table with the ledger open in front of her, and they saw Silas at the far end with his arms folded and his eyes on the fire, and they understood without a word being spoken that something was happening at this table that did not require their voices in it. Toby went to the stove and he made a fresh pot of coffee very quietly, and he set a fresh tin cup at Della's elbow, and he withdrew. Rhett took the yellow dog and he sat on the hearthstone with his back against the warm stone, and he took up a piece of harness leather, and he worked the awl in the firelight without looking up. The two younger brothers held the silence the way men hold a rope for a brother who is climbing. Della read. She found the first false entry on the second page she turned. December of 1870, a charge of $47 to the Hollister account at Mercer Mercantile for handling on a silver assay shipment that, according to the matching entry on the next page in Silas's own hand, had not been a Hollister assay shipment at all, but a courtesy carry done for a neighbor, the Hollisters taking no fee. $47 on a courtesy. The pen in Della's hand made a small, neat tick on the foolscap sheet, and she wrote the date and the figure and the word handling next to it, and she turned the page. She found the second false entry on the same page, and the third on the next. She went forward through the spring of 1871 and through the summer, and the false entries were a slow, steady drip, never large enough to draw attention, never absent for more than a season. By the autumn of 1872, the drip had become a thin, steady stream. By 1875, the stream had become bold, and the man who was writing the false entries had stopped bothering to disguise them with plausible names. They were called handling. They were called fees. They were called on one page in 1876 simply adjustment. Adjustment of $72.50 against a silver assay that should have come back to the Hollisters at 1140. Della made her ticks. She wrote her dates. She filled the first sheet of foolscap and started a second. The cabin around her had grown deeply quiet. The fire had burned down twice, and twice Rhett had risen without a word and put a fresh log on, and twice he had sat down again, and the slow, soft pop of the resin had become the only sound in the room except for the small, dry sound of Della Ashford turning the pages of the ledger. She came to the autumn of 1870 a second time because she had to go back and check one entry against another, and that was when she saw it. It was on the inside of the back cover, the very back, the place in a ledger where a careful keeper of books sometimes tucked a folded receipt or a torn page of memoranda for safekeeping. There was a small bulge there that she had not noticed when she had opened the book. She put her thumb under the corner of the leather and she eased the bulge gently out into the lamplight. It was a folded sheet of writing paper. It had been folded so long ago that the creases of the fold had become permanent, and the paper at the creases was thin and fragile. It was a letter. The hand on the outside fold was a woman's hand, fine and round and careful. The hand had written on the outside fold a single word, Silas. Della did not unfold it, not yet. She held it in her bandaged hands the way a person holds a small bird, and she looked across the long table at the man at the far end. He had not moved in 2 hours. He was watching the fire. Silas, he looked up. There is a letter inside the back cover of your ledger. It is written in a woman's hand. Your name is on the outside of the fold. I have not opened it. I do not know how long it has been there. But it has been there for some years, by the way. The paper has aged, and I think you have never seen it. Silas Hollister sat very still in his chair at the far end of the table. When he spoke, his voice was low and slow, the voice of a man who is moving carefully through a room in the dark because he does not yet know what is in the room with him. Read it to me, Della. Silas, it is your letter. It is in your house. It is your name on the outside. Read it to me, please. I do not trust my hands to open it. Read it to me, Della Ashford, in your own voice, the way you read Browning to yourself last night by the fire. She unfolded the letter. The paper had been folded for 8 years. It opened with a small dry sound. The hand on the inside was the same fine round hand, the name on the outside, and the ink was the same brown as the ink of the false entries from the autumn of 1870. There was a date at the top of the page, November the 20th, 1870. There were perhaps 30 lines of writing. Della read the first line silently and the second, and her hands began to tremble inside their wrappings, and she set the page flat on the table on top of the open ledger, and she began to read aloud. My dear Silas, the letter began, I am going to put this in the back of the Green Ranch book where you write your own entries every Sunday night because I know that you will turn to it sooner or later in the new year, and you will find this letter then, if I do not have the courage to give it to you in person before then. I hope I will have the courage. I am writing it tonight in case I do not. There is something I have been trying to tell you for 3 weeks, and I have not known how to say it without sounding like a foolish woman who is meddling in the business of men. I am going to say it now in a letter because a letter is patient and I can say it once and not have to say it again with my voice trembling. I have been keeping the ranch books carefully for the last 6 months since you asked me in the spring to take that small chore off your shoulders so that you could ride the south fence in the long days of summer. I have been comparing them every second Wednesday against Mr. Mercer's book at the Mercantile, the way my own father taught me to compare books in the kitchen of our house in Pennsylvania when I was a girl. And I have found in comparing them a thing I cannot explain except by one explanation, and the one explanation is that Mr. Mercer at the Mercantile has been adding small charges against your accounts that do not match any goods you have taken delivery of or any services you have asked of him. The charges are small in any one month. They are not small across 6 months. They are not small at all. I have made a list of them, and the list is folded inside this letter. And the total at the bottom of the list for the 6 months I have been keeping your books is $284.70. I have not shown the list to anyone else. I am showing it only to you. Silas, I think Mr. Mercer has been doing this for longer than 6 months. I think he has been doing it since you opened the account with him in 1869. I do not know how much it has cost the ranch over those 18 months because I have not seen the older books in his store, but I think you should look at them. I think you should look at them with the same eye my father taught me to look at a column of figures, which is the eye of a person who is not afraid to find a thief. I am going to tell you this in person tomorrow morning over the coffee. I have been putting it off because I have been afraid you would think I was being a foolish woman. I do not think you will think that anymore. I think you will be angry, but I do not think you will be angry at me. I think the man you will be angry at is the man who has been taking from you while smiling at you across his counter on the second Wednesday of every month, and I think you will be right to be angry. But I want you to promise me, my love, that when you go down the mountain to put your hand on Mr. Mercer, you will go down with Toby and with Red, and you will not go down alone because a man who has been quietly stealing from another man for a year and a half is a man who has decided some time ago that he does not have a soul to lose, and a man who has decided that is a more dangerous man than he looks behind a counter. I love you, Silas Hollister. I have loved you from the night you came in from the south fence with your hands torn from the wire, and you sat down at this table and you let me wash them with hot water and a clean cloth, and you did not say one word the whole time, and you only looked at me as if I had walked out of a dream you had been having since you were a boy. I will tell you in the morning. I will hold the baby's hand while I tell you because I want you to hear it from me with our child between us. Your wife, your Lenora. Della Ashford set the letter down on the open ledger. The cabin was perfectly silent. The fire popped once, then it did not pop again. Red on the hearthstone with the awl in his hand had stopped moving entirely. Toby at the stove had set down the coffee pot and was standing very still with one hand on the warm iron. Silas Hollister at the far end of the table had not made a sound, but his face had gone the color of bone china, and his eyes were fixed on the page in the lamplight, and his hands were flat on the wood, and Della could see even at the distance of the table that the knuckles of those hands had gone white. He spoke. His voice was very small. She knew. She knew Silas. She was going to tell me in the morning. The morning. The morning was the morning the storm came in. She went into her labor early, and she went out into the snow to find me at the south fence. And the reason she went out into the snow to find me at the south fence was not because she could not bear the labor alone in the cabin. The reason was that she had been waiting all evening to tell me about the ledger, and the labor came on her early, and she thought in her clear, practical way that she should fetch me at once because I needed to hear about the ledger as much as I needed to be home for the baby. And so she put on her coat and she walked into the snow. He stopped. He swallowed. The ledger killed her, Della. No, Silas. The ledger did not kill her. The man who put the false entries in the ledger killed her, Mercer. Mercer. Toby took one step forward from the stove, and his big, quiet hands were not quiet anymore. They were closing into fists at his sides, and the broad slope of his shoulders, which Della had only ever seen bent over an anvil or a coffee pot or a piece of harness, was now the broad slope of a man whose body had remembered all in one moment that it could be used for things other than work. Silas, Toby said in a voice Della had never heard from him before, was, "Did Mercer know she had been keeping the books?" Silas closed his eyes. She used to walk down to the mercantile on the second Wednesday of every month to settle the accounts in person because she said the second Wednesday was when the silver came back from Helena, and she liked to see the figures fresh. Mercer would have known. Mercer would have seen her at his counter every second Wednesday of every month going through his book with her own pencil. Mercer would have understood the first or second time it happened that Lenora Hollister was not a woman whose ledger he could skim from. He would have understood it, and he would have begun to be afraid of her, and he would have begun to think of what to do about her. And on the second Wednesday of December of that year, Silas said, his voice flat, she did not come down to the mercantile. The storm had begun on the Monday. He would not have known, sitting in his store behind his counter, whether she had not come down because of the storm or because she was about to come down with something more dangerous than the figures in the book. He would not have known whether she had told me yet, and so he came up the mountain, Toby said. The four of them looked at each other across the lamplight. It was Della who made the small connection that the brothers had not yet made out loud. She looked down at her sheets of foolscap, where the ticks of the false entries marched in their slow, steady rhythm through the autumn of 1870, and she turned the page of the ledger she had been working on, and she came to an entry she had not yet recorded because she had not yet understood it as one of the false ones. It was in the credit column. It was dated the 17th of December, 1870, 3 days before Lenora Hollister had walked into the snow. It was a charge against the Hollister account in the amount of $2.20. The description written in the same hand that had written the handling charges and the adjustment charges and the small, slow theft of 8 years was these words: strychnine, for wolf control, charged to Hollister. Della read the entry aloud. She read it twice. She put her finger on the page beside it, and she said very quietly, "Silas, there is no wolf control in December in this country. The wolves are denned up by the second week of November. Anyone who has lived in these mountains for more than one winter knows that strychnine charged against your account on the 17th of December of 1870 was not strychnine for wolves. It was strychnine for something else. And it was charged against your account so that if anything ever came of it, the paper would point at you, not at the man who bought it." The fire popped once in the hearth. The whole cabin understood in the same moment what the entry meant. Rhett rose slowly from the hearthstone. He set the harness leather down on the warm stone behind him. His young face had gone hard, the same way it had gone hard the morning Della had told them about the room above the Mercantile. It was harder now. It was the hardness of a man who had loved his sister-in-law for 2 years and had buried her in a churchyard down in the valley 8 years ago, and had carried every day since the small, unspoken belief that he should never have left the cabin that week to go on a hunt with Toby, because if one of them had been at home, she would not have walked out alone. "He poisoned her," Rhett said. He did not say it as a question. He said it the way a man reads a verdict. "He poisoned her," Silas said. "Or he gave her something that brought her labor on early enough that the cold would do the killing for him." Either one. The end of it was that he took her down before she could tell me, and he made sure that the paper that recorded the taking pointed at me if anyone ever came looking, and he banked on the fact that no one would come looking because in 1870 there was no one in this valley who would have spent 5 minutes asking questions about the death of a woman in a snowstorm. He was right about that. No one came. Not for 8 years, until tonight. Until a Boston girl walked into my house with a mother's ring in her hand and an eye for a sick ledger in her head, and read the book my Lenora had read in 1870, and could not finish reading because the man who wrote the book killed her for starting to read it. Della Ashford folded the letter very carefully along its old creases. She set it down on top of the page of the ledger that bore the strychnine entry. She set her own list of false entries on top of the letter. 3 pieces of paper stacked one on the other, and on those 3 pieces of paper rested the 8-year murder of a woman named Lenora Hollister, and the planned future murder of a woman named Adelaide Ashford, and the planned theft of a ranch that fed 3 men and gave a forage to a valley. She took her mother's gold ring from inside the hem of the gray dress where she had stitched it that morning, after she finished mending the navy blue traveling dress, and she set the ring down on top of the 3 pieces of paper in the middle of the table in the lamplight, where all 4 of them could see it. "I am going down the mountain with you when you go," she said. "I am going to make a sworn statement to a man with a star on his coat. I'm going to put my name on a paper next to the names in this ledger, and I am going to look across a courtroom at Cyrus Mercer, and I am going to tell a judge in Helena exactly what I read in this book and exactly what I heard through the floorboards above his store on the second night of December the 16th of this year. I am not afraid of him, Silas. I was afraid of him for 3 days in his town. I am not afraid of him in this house. There is a difference between the 2 fears, and the difference is the 3 of you, and the 8 years your Lenora has been waiting for somebody to read her letter." Silas Hollister stood up from the chair at the far end of the table. He walked the length of the table slowly, and he stopped at the corner where Della was sitting, and he did not touch her because the space between them was still the space he had set in October when he had written the letter, And in November, when he had waited at the stage and on the morning after the storm, when he had said the conversation does not happen until the thaw, but he stood close enough to her chair that she could see the wet at the inside corners of his whiskey-colored eyes, and she could see the slow movement in his throat as he tried to find a voice that would carry the words he needed to say. When the words came, they came in a voice that was not quite steady. Della Ashford, you came up out of that snow with a ring in your hand, and you asked if I would buy it. And I told you that gold was not for eating, and that this house did not work in such trade. I want to tell you tonight, in front of my brothers, and in front of the lamp, and in front of the letter my wife wrote 8 years ago, that I did not have the eyes to find on my own, that I was wrong about the trade. I was wrong because I thought the trade you were offering me was a piece of gold for a meal. The trade you were offering me was your whole self for one chance to keep walking, and I had no idea that night what I was being offered because you had not yet shown me what was inside you. You have shown me tonight. You have shown me a thing my Lenore was trying to show me 8 years ago, and I am going to spend the rest of the time I am alive being grateful for it. And I am going to spend tomorrow morning beginning the work of putting Cyrus Mercer in front of the only judge in Montana Territory I trust. His name is Augustus Reed. He is a United States Marshal in Helena. He knew our father in Missouri before any of us were born. Toby and Rhett are going to ride for Helena before first light. I am going to stay here on this mountain with you until they come back, because Mercer will know that you have not gone to Boston, and Mercer will not wait long before he comes up this road himself. Do you understand what I am telling you, Della? I understand you will not be in this house alone for 1 minute between now and the time Marshal Reed walks through that door. I know. Do you trust me to keep that promise? She looked at him in the lamplight. She looked at the lines around his mouth and the small white scar through his left eyebrow and the wet at the inside corners of his eyes that he had stopped trying to hide, and she answered him in the only way the answer could honestly be given. Silas Hollister, I trusted you the morning after the storm when I came out of the small bedroom and you sat 3 chairs away from me at this table and you told me that the conversation about the contract did not happen until the thaw. I trust you now because you have just stood at my elbow with a letter from your wife on the table between us, and you have not so much as taken my hand. A man who keeps a distance he has promised to keep is a man whose other promises are worth something. I trust you. I trust your brothers. I will be in this house when you need me to be in it, and I will be on the porch with the long gun when the sleigh bells come up the road, and I will be in the courtroom in Helena when the day comes, and I am not going anywhere, Silas, until the man who killed your Lenora is hanging from the end of a rope in the yard of the territorial jail. The fire pops softly in the hearth. Outside the cabin, the wind off the Bitterroot Range was rising again, the way it had risen on the night 2.5 weeks ago when a Boston girl with a ring in her hand had come up out of the timber. But this time the wind had nothing in it that the 4 people in the long room of the Hollister cabin were afraid of, because the 4 people in the long room had laid 3 pieces of paper and a gold ring on a plank table in the lamplight, and they had named between them the man who had cost them 8 years of grief, and they had decided between them that the 8 years was going to end. Silas Hollister reached down very slowly and he picked up Della Ashford's mother's ring from the top of the small stack of papers, and he held it for a moment in his big scarred palm where it had been the first time he had seen it on the porch in the snow. Then he set it back down on top of the stack with the same careful gentleness he had used the night he had pressed it into her closed fist while she lay unconscious in the cedar-smelling bed. Toby, he said. Rhett, we ride at first light. Della, you and I are going to spend the rest of tonight at this table making a clean copy of every false entry in the book, and we are going to make 2 copies, and 1 copy is going into Toby's saddlebag, and 1 copy is staying in this cabin in a place I will show you, because a man who has killed once for a ledger will not stop at killing a second time for the same ledger. And the only thing more dangerous to Mercer than this book is 2 copies of this book in 2 different houses with 2 different witnesses. Are you with me? I am with you. Then turn the page, Della Ashford. Turn the page and let us begin. She turned the page. They worked through the night, the 4 of them, Toby brought fresh coffee twice. Rhett kept the fire fed. Silas at the far end of the table copied each entry Della called out to him in his square, firm hand, 2 copies on 2 separate sheets. And when the sky outside the small window began to turn the iron color of a winter dawn, the work was done. 2 clean lists of every false entry from the autumn of 1870 to the present day. 2 copies of Lenora's letter, recopied carefully by Della, in her own neatest hand, with the original letter folded back into the back of the green ledger, where Lenora had placed it 8 years before. The total at the bottom of the new lists came to $9,412.30. Toby and Rhett left at first light. They left without a meal, drinking only black coffee at the door because the road to Helena was 3 days at hard pace and they meant to make it in 2. Silas stood with them in the yard while they tightened the cinches and stowed the saddlebags. He did not embrace them. He set his hand on the shoulder of each of them in turn. He said, "Ride safe." He said, "Bring the marshal back." He said, "Your sister Lenora has been waiting 8 years for you to take this ride." They mounted up and they rode down the trail toward the broken pine. In the gray light, 2 large men in heavy coats, on 2 stout horses, and Della stood on the porch in Silas's heavy coat and watched until the timber took them. Then Silas turned to her. "Della, inside we have work of our own." The work of that day was the work of a man and a woman preparing a fortified house for siege. Silas walked her through every door and every window and every shutter of the cabin and the outbuildings. He showed her where the spare powder was kept and where the Henry rifle hung above the loft ladder and where his father's old coach gun was bracketed under the kitchen counter behind a cloth. He showed her the trap door in the floor of the small bedroom that opened down into a stone-walled root cellar his father had dug 10 years ago, big enough for a person to lie flat in, accessible only from the bedroom and from a single narrow tunnel that came up under the floor of the smokehouse. He showed her the loophole in the south wall of the main room, where the chinking had been left thin on purpose, and he showed her how to widen it with a knife in 20 seconds if the time came. He did all of it without alarming her. He did all of it the way a man teaches a child to swim calmly, steadily, with the assumption that the child is capable of learning. "Now you," he said. He took her out to the back porch where a stump had been set up as a target, and he put the smaller of the 2 Colt revolvers in her bandaged hands, and he showed her how to hold it and how to brace it and how to breathe out before she squeezed. She fired 6 shots. 3 of them missed the stump entirely. 3 of them struck within a hand's breadth of the center. Silas looked at the stump. He looked at her. He said, "That is better than half the men I rode with in my younger days. We will do this again at noon and again at sundown until you can put 6 in a circle the size of a dinner plate. And then if the time comes, you will not need to think about your hands. Your hands will already know." They worked at it 3 times that day. By the 3rd session at sundown in the bitter cold of the back porch, Della Ashford was placing 5 out of 6 inside the circle of a dinner plate at 20 paces. Silas did not praise her. He only nodded the same grave half-inch of the head that Toby gave her every morning, and he said that will do. That night they slept in shifts. Silas took the first watch in the rocking chair by the front window, with the Henry across his knees. Della slept 3 hours on the cot in the main room, fully dressed, her boots on the floor beside her, and the smaller Colt under the folded coat she used as a pillow. At midnight she rose and she took the rifle, and she sat in the rocking chair by the front window, and Silas slept 3 hours on the same cot. They did not speak of fear. They did not need to. The fear was the air in the cabin, and they were both breathing it. The second day passed the same way. A drill on the back porch in the morning, a drill at noon, a drill at sundown. Della baked bread at the stove between drills because the rhythm of the dough kept her hands from shaking. Silas oiled both rifles in the coach gun and laid out spare cartridges in small, neat rows on the kitchen table, the way a doctor lays out instruments before a surgery. The sky outside the small window stayed iron and gray, and the wind off the range never quite dropped. And twice during the day, Della thought she heard the distant jingle of harness bells far down the trail, and twice it turned out to be a trick of the wind in the lodgepole pines. It was on the third morning, just past 9 o'clock, that the bells were real. Della heard them first. She was at the kitchen window with a cloth in her hands, drying a tin plate, and the sound came up out of the timber on the lower trail, the unmistakable, bright, cheerful sound of harness bells on a sleigh. She set the plate down very slowly on the counter. She walked without hurrying into the main room and she said to Silas, "Bells." Silas was already moving. He had heard them a half second after she had. He took the Henry from above the loft ladder and he checked the chamber and he handed her the smaller Colt from the kitchen counter. He said, "Root cellar. Now." "No. Della, I'm not going into the cellar until I see who it is. If it is Mercer with 2 men, I will go. If it is the marshal back from Helena, I will not. I am not going to spend the rest of my life telling myself I hid in a hole while you stood in the door." Silas looked at her for one long moment in the cold gray light of the cabin. Then he nodded once to the same grave half-inch, and he said the loophole on the south wall. "You take the Colt. You watch through the loophole, Ifur. If you hear me say the word now, you go down through the trapdoor, and you do not come up until you hear my voice or the voice of Marshal Reed. Are we agreed?" "Agreed." The bells came up the last of the trail. The sleigh broke out of the timber into the clearing in front of the cabin, and Della at the loophole saw it clearly, and her heart did the one cold drop she had been bracing for since the night above the Mercantile. It was Mercer. He was sitting in the front seat in his great buffalo coat, with a smile on his red face as if he were paying a social call. There were 2 men in the seat behind him. Both of them were armed. Both of them were the men whose voices she had heard faintly through the floorboards on the night of December 16th. And there was a third rider just behind the sleigh on a bay horse, a thin man with a tin star pinned crookedly on the lapel of a coat that did not fit him. And Della understood at one glance that the star was no more real than the smile on Mercer's face. Silas opened the front door before Mercer's sleigh had stopped. He stepped out onto the porch with the Henry held loose at his side, the way a man holds a tool he is comfortable with, and he stood at the top of the porch steps and he waited. Silas Hollister Mercer called out in the warm, hearty voice he used in his store, "I have come up here on official business, friend. This is Deputy Caulfield from Helena, just arrived yesterday on a special commission. We have a paper for a Miss Adelaide Ashford, a paper from Judge Briggs. The Helena Charitable Foundation for Indigent Women has filed a guardianship claim. The girl is a runaway from their custody, and she has been seen on this mountain. We are here to take her into protective care. I am sorry to do it under such circumstances, Silas, but the law is the law." Silas did not move from the top of the porch steps. He looked at the deputy. He looked at the 2 men in the back of the sleigh. He looked finally at Cyrus Mercer. "Show me the paper," he said. Mercer reached into the inside of his buffalo coat and brought out a folded sheet of cream-colored paper with a wax seal at the bottom. He held it out at arm's length. Silas did not step down to take it. He said, "Deputy Caulfield, bring it up." The thin man dismounted and walked the paper up the porch steps and put it in Silas's free hand and stepped back. He did not look Silas in the eye while he did it. Della, watching through the loophole, saw the way the deputy's hand trembled as he passed the paper across, and she understood that this was a man whose courage came out of a bottle and was running thin in the cold. Silas unfolded the paper. He read it slowly, the way a man reads a thing he wants to remember accurately. Then he folded it again very carefully, and he looked up at Mercer. "Earth," he said in a tone that was almost conversational, "there is no Helena Charitable Foundation for Indigent Women. I know there is not, because my brothers rode for Helena 2 days ago to sit in the office of United States Marshal Augustus Reed, and Marshal Reed has spent the last 12 years prosecuting men who file fraudulent guardianship papers in this territory. He keeps a list of every charitable foundation operating in Montana, and he updates it every quarter, and any foundation not on the list cannot file in any court in Helena. I know about the list because Marshal Reed sent my father a copy of it in 1873, and the copy is in this cabin. As for Judge Briggs, Briggs sat on the bench in Helena until 1876. He has been dead for 2 years. The seal at the bottom of this paper is a forgery of a dead man's seal. Mercer's face did not change at first. The smile stayed where it was. But the eyes above the smile went very small and very still, and Della at the loophole saw the moment when the man inside the buffalo coat understood that he had walked into a trap. Silas Mercer said softly, "Be reasonable. The girl is property. She has debts in town. She has stolen goods from my store. There is no need for any of this to be unpleasant." Silas said, in the same conversational tone, "The only goods you ever held of hers was a cameo brooch you took as security against a room you locked her into from the outside. The only debt she ever owed in your town was the debt of her own breath, which you meant to sell to a man named Brennan in Helena for $400. And the only foundation she has ever belonged to is the foundation under this porch, which my father laid in the summer of 1868, and which is not going to be moved by any forged paper in any man's coat. Now I am going to ask you and your two friends and Deputy Caulfield to turn that sleigh around and ride back down this mountain, and I am going to ask you to do it without anyone reaching for a gun. Because if a gun is reached for on this porch, the first man it is reached for by is going to be the last thing he does on this earth." The two men in the back of the sleigh had begun to move their hands toward their coats while Silas was speaking. Della at the loophole saw it. She saw the older of the two slide his right hand under the lapel of his coat where a shoulder holster would be, and she saw the younger one ease his rifle barrel up off his knee. She did not wait. She did not call out the word now because Silas had not said it. She slid the smaller Colt through the loophole, braced her bandaged hand against the inside of the wall, the way Silas had taught her, breathed out, and she did not fire at a man. She fired one careful shot into the wood of the sleigh's footboard between the boots of the older of the two men. The crack of the shot in the cold air was very loud. The man's hand jerked back out of his coat as if he had been bitten. For one heartbeat, nobody on the porch or in the sleigh moved. Silas did not look back at the cabin. He did not need to. He said in the same calm conversational tone that was a warning shot from inside the cabin, "The next one is not. Cyrus, you have 10 seconds to turn this sleigh around." Mercer turned the sleigh around. He did it with the small, careful movements of a man who has just understood that the road ahead of him has narrowed to one lane and there is a cliff on either side. The two men in the back kept their hands in plain view on their knees. Deputy Caulfield mounted his bay horse with hands that were shaking visibly now, and he did not look back at the porch as he rode down the trail behind the sleigh. The bells of the sleigh were not cheerful when they faded into the timber. They were the sound of a man retreating, and the sound was not good for him. Silas came back into the cabin and he closed the door, and he set the Henry against the wall by the door, and he turned to Della, and she was still standing at the loophole with the Colt in her hand and the slow ringing of her own shot still in her ears. "Della Ashford," he said, "that was as good a shot as any man on this mountain could have made, and it was made with a head as cold as any I have ever seen on any porch I have ever stood on. Your father raised more than a bookkeeper. He raised a daughter who had a sister to come back for," Della said. She set the Colt down on the kitchen counter very carefully, and her hand was steady, and she looked at it for a moment and thought, "Oh, I am not afraid anymore." But Silas's face had grown still. He walked back to the front window, and he looked down the trail where the sleigh had gone, and he said, "Della, he is not going to ride back to Silver Creek and accept that. He is going to ride to wherever he can hire two more men, and he is going to come back. He may come back tonight. He may come back tomorrow. But he is going to come back, and when he comes back the second time, he is going to come back the way a man comes back, when he has decided he has nothing left to lose. We have one day, perhaps two, before he is on this porch again. How long until your brothers and the marshal can be here? 3 days at the soonest, 4 if the weather turns. Then we hold the cabin for 3 days. Then we hold the cabin for 3 days. The next day and a half passed in a fortified silence. They did not stop the drills. They added new ones. Silas taught her how to load the Colt one-handed. He taught her how to listen to the difference between the wind in the high pasture pines and the wind in the lower timber. He showed her where to stand inside the trap door of the small bedroom so that she could not be seen from above, but could fire upward through the gap if a man came through the door. They ate cold biscuits and jerked beef, and they took turns sleeping in 3-hour shifts. And they spoke very little because everything that needed to be said had been said the night Della read the letter aloud, and the rest was waiting. It was on the second morning, just before dawn, that the sound of horses came up out of the timber. Della was in the rocking chair at the front window with the Henry across her knees. Silas was asleep on the cot. She did not call out. She listened. The sound was not the cheerful jingle of harness bells. It was the muffled sound of horses walking in the snow, more than 2, perhaps 4, perhaps 5, with men trying to hold them quiet. She set the Henry against the wall, and she crossed the room and she put her hand on Silas's shoulder, and his eyes opened the way a hunting dog's eyes open, fully awake in one breath, and he sat up. 5 horses, Della whispered, coming up the lower trail, walking quiet. Silas was on his feet in 3 seconds with a coach gun in his hands. Root cellar, he said. This time you go. Silas, Della, this time you go. Mercer is not here for a paper. He is here to kill us both and burn the cabin and tell the marshal there was an accident. If you are in the cellar, he cannot find you. And if I fall, you wait until you hear the marshal's voice and not 1 second sooner. Do you understand me? I understand you. But Silas, you take the Henry and you take the coach gun. I am leaving you the Colt at the loophole, and I am taking the spare in the cellar with me. If they get past you and they come into this cabin and they stand on that bedroom floor over my head, I am going to fire up through the boards, and I am going to remember every drill we did, and they are not going to walk back out of this house. Do you understand me? I understand you, Silas said. He was already moving toward the door. He stopped at the kitchen, turned back, and he closed the small distance between them in 2 strides, and he set his big scarred hand on the side of her face, just for one moment, the first time he had laid a deliberate hand on her since the night he had carried her in from the snow, and he said in a voice that was not quite steady, Della Ashford, when this is over, and the marshal is here, and the man is in chains, I am going to ask you a question. I am asking you tonight to live long enough to answer it. I will live long enough, she said. She went down through the trap door with the spare Colt in her bandaged hand, and Silas closed the trap door over her head, and she heard his footsteps cross the floor above her and the soft sound of the front door closing behind him. And then there was the long, terrible silence that comes before any first shot. It came perhaps 3 minutes later. The first shot was the heavy bark of the coach gun from the front porch, followed at once by 2 answering rifle shots from the timber, and then by a man's voice crying out in pain. Then there was a pause, then 4 more rifle shots, faster, from at least 3 different positions in the trees. Della heard a heavy body fall on the porch boards above her head, and her heart stopped, but the body got up again, and she heard Silas swear once under his breath, and then the coach gun fired again, and another voice in the timber went silent. She heard Silas pull back into the cabin. She heard the front door close. She heard him cross to the loophole on the south wall, and she heard the Henry begin to work in his hands, the steady, measured fire of a man who has been shooting since he was a boy and is not going to waste a single round. She counted his shots. 4, 5, 6. There was an answering volley from the timber, and one of the rounds came through the south wall above her head and buried itself in the doorframe of the bedroom with a sharp, dry thump. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at the porch. Then she heard a sound she had not been listening for, a sound from above and behind her, from the direction of the smokehouse. The narrow tunnel that came up under the smokehouse floor ran past the back of the root cellar where she was lying, and through the stone wall she could just make out the soft scrape of boots on dirt. Someone had found the tunnel. Someone was crawling along it toward the cabin from behind. Whoever it was had not yet reached the trapdoor in the bedroom. But whoever it was meant to. Della rose silently in the dark of the cellar. She moved to the wall closest to the tunnel. She braced her back against the cold stone. She held the Colt low in both bandaged hands the way Silas had taught her. She breathed out very slowly and she waited. The scraping came closer. There was the soft sound of a man swearing under his breath in a familiar voice. It was Mercer himself. Of course it was Mercer himself. He had sent his hired men in at the front, and he had come around the back through the tunnel like the patient, careful thief he had been for 8 years. And he meant to come up under Silas in the cabin and shoot him in the back while Silas was returning fire from the loophole. He emerged from the mouth of the tunnel into the dim cellar with a small bullseye lantern in one hand and a Navy revolver in the other, and he was breathing hard. And he was smiling, the small, private smile he had been smiling in the back office of the Mercantile the night Della had heard him through the floorboards. He did not see her at first because she was standing very still in the deep shadow against the back wall, and his eye was on the ladder up to the trap door. She let him take 2 steps toward the ladder. Then she said very quietly, "Mr. Mercer." He turned. The lantern in his hand swung. The smile on his face did the strangest thing. It tried to stay smiling for 1/2 of 1 second, and then it fell off entirely, and in what was underneath it was a face Della had not seen before. A face that was very old and very tired and very afraid. The face of a man who had spent 8 years believing he had gotten away with everything and had just understood in one heartbeat that he had not. "Boston girl," he said. "The Boston girl in the cellar. The Boston girl in the cellar," she said, "with a Colt. And a list of every false entry in your book since 1870. And a copy of the strychnine charge from the 17th of December that year. And a letter from Lenora Hollister you have been afraid of for 8 years. Drop the gun, Mr. Mercer." He did not drop the gun. He raised it. He was an old man, and he was not as fast as he used to be. And Della Ashford had been drilling for 2 days on the back porch with a man who had taught her to breathe out before she squeezed. She fired 1 shot. It struck him in the right shoulder, exactly where she had aimed, exactly where Toby had marked the silhouette on the back porch stump with a piece of charcoal. The Navy revolver dropped from his hand. Mercer staggered backward against the cellar wall and slid down it slowly, his face going gray. His good hand pressed to the wound, and the bullseye lantern fell and rolled and lay in the dirt, throwing a thin yellow circle of light on his boots. Della stepped forward. She kicked the Navy revolver away into the dark. She set the muzzle of the Colt against the side of his throat just below the ear, and she said very quietly, "Mr. Mercer, you are going to live. I am not going to give Silas the kindness of a body. I am going to give him a courtroom in Helena and a witness chair and a noose. Do you understand me?" He understood her. He nodded once against the muzzle. Above them, the Henry kept working. There was another rifle shot from the timber. Then there was a long silence, the kind of silence that comes when men outside have just realized that the man they brought to the front of the cabin is no longer firing back at them. Then faintly from a long way down the trail came a new sound, the sound of many hooves at a hard gallop, the sound of riders coming up the lower trail in earnest, in a clear, strong voice calling out, "Hold your fire! Hold your fire! This is United States Marshal Augustus Reed of the Helena office. Hold your fire." Della Ashford stood in the dim of the cellar with one hand on the Colt and one hand on the rope around the wrists of Cyrus Mercer that she was tying with the calm, steady fingers of a woman who had been folding shirts in this house for 19 days. And she heard above her the sound of Silas Hollister's boots crossing the cabin floor toward the front door, and she heard him pull the door open and call out into the cold gray dawn, Marshal Reed. They are at the timber line, 3 of them, one down on the porch already." She heard the answering call. She heard the gallop of horses come up into the yard. She heard the brief, sharp exchange of 2 more rifle shots, and then nothing. She heard a man's voice she did not know say, "All secured, Marshal. 2 in custody, 1 dead in the snow at the porch step." She heard Silas say, "The head of it is in my cellar. The Boston girl took him with 1 shot. She is bringing him up." Della guided Cyrus Mercer up the ladder ahead of her, with the Colt at his back, and she came up through the trap door into the small bedroom, and through the bedroom into the main room of the cabin, and the main room was full of men in heavy coats with carbines in their hands, and the cold gray light of the December dawn coming in through the open front door, and at the front of them all stood a tall, lean man with a graying beard and a tin star on his coat that looked very real with Toby and Rhett Hollister at either shoulder. And behind them all stood Silas Hollister, with blood on the side of his face from a graze and the Henry rifle in his hand, and an expression on his face that Della would remember for the rest of her life. Marshal Augustus Reed looked at the bound man in front of Della. He looked at Della. He looked at the bandaged hands in the gray dress, in the small, steady Colt, in the cornflower blue eyes that were not flinching. He took off his hat very slowly. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I have ridden hard on a cold road for 2.5 days on the strength of a story 2 boys told me in my office, and I want you to know that not 1 mile of that ride was too long." "Are you injured?" "I am not injured," she said. "Then if you will permit me," Marshal Reed said, "I will take this gentleman off your hands." She handed Cyrus Mercer over with both bandaged hands, and the moment her hands were empty, she walked across the long main room of the cabin, past 3 deputies and 2 Hollister brothers, and 1 United States Marshal, and she walked straight to Silas Hollister. And Silas Hollister set the Henry down against the wall, and he opened his arms and she walked into them, and his arms closed around her for the first time since the night he had carried her unconscious off the porch and laid her down by the fire 19 days ago. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He held her and she held him, and the men in the cabin had the good grace to look elsewhere for the long moment that followed. The trial of Cyrus Mercer was held in Helena in the 2nd week of February of 1879. Della Ashford testified on the first day. She wore the navy blue traveling dress she had worn Westmended now and brushed clean with her mother's gold ring on the 3rd finger of her right hand because she had decided she was done hiding it in any hem ever again. She told the courtroom about the room above the mercantile and the voices through the floorboards. She told them about the green ledger and the false entries and the 8-year theft. She read aloud from the witness stand the letter Lenora Hollister had folded into the back of the Green Book in November of 1870, and she read it without trembling, because she had practiced reading it without trembling many times in the cabin in the weeks of January with Silas listening from the chair across the hearth. Marshal Reed presented the records of 3 other women who had died in 3 other winters in the Bitterroot Valley between 1872 and 1877, all wives of prosperous ranchers, all with strychnine charges, entered against their husbands' accounts at Mercer Mercantile in the weeks before their deaths. The pattern was clear. The jury was out for less than an hour. Cyrus Mercer was hanged in the yard of the Territorial Prison in Helena on the 7th of April, 1879. Silas Hollister and his brothers were present. Della was not. She had ridden the train back to Boston the week before with Marshal Reed's letter of authorization in her bag and an order from the Territorial Court empowering her as the legal guardian of one Lillian Leonetta Ashford to remove her sister from the household of one Bartholomew Pierce by any means necessary with the assistance of any peace officer she might require. Pierce surrendered the child without a fight when he saw the badge of the Boston deputy who came up the front steps of the house on Beacon Street with Della at his side. Etta walked out of that house in a coat too thin for the journey west, and a face so changed from the 12-year-old who had fallen asleep with her hand under her cheek in November that Della almost did not know her, and she would not let go of Della's hand for the entire train ride back to Cheyenne. When Etta stepped off the stage at Silver Creek on the 15th of May of 1879, she was 13 years old, and the snow on the Bitterroot Range had melted out of the valleys, and the air smelled of new grass and cold water from the high creeks, and 3 tall men in clean shirts were waiting for her at the platform behind her older sister. Etta looked at the 3 of them. She looked at Della. She said in the small, clear voice of a child who has decided she's going to live, "Am I going to have 3 brothers-in-law?" Della laughed. "Not 3, she said. 1, but you are going to have 3 brothers, and you are not going to be afraid of any man for the rest of your natural life." Silas Hollister and Adelaide Ashford were married on the 11th of June, 1879, in a small clearing on the south slope of the mountain above the cabin, by a circuit preacher who came through the valley once a year. Toby stood at his brother's right shoulder. Rhett stood at the left. Etta carried wildflowers gathered that morning from the high meadow. The ring Silas slipped onto Della's finger was made of silver beaten and shaped by Toby in the forge over the course of 3 weeks, with a tiny chip of bright bullion from the Hollister claim set into the band where another man might have set a stone. Della wore it on the third finger of her left hand. On the third finger of her right hand, she still wore her mother's gold band, and she would wear it for the rest of her life. That night, when the supper was over and the songs were sung, and the brothers had gone out to walk under the stars and give their elder his privacy, Silas carried his wife across the threshold of the cabin and closed the door behind them. And outside the door, the soft Montana spring wind moved across the new grass of the south meadow. And what was said and done between them on that first night belonged to them and not to any storyteller. And when the morning came, everything between them was as it ought to be. The years that followed were the long good years that men of 60 and 70 will tell. You go faster than any other years in a life, but they did not feel fast at the time. They felt like every day was its own small, honest piece of work, and that is the only way good years ever feel to the people who are living them. In the spring of 1880, Etta Ashford began her first term at the Silver Creek Schoolhouse, where she would prove to be the brightest pupil the school had seen in a decade, and she would graduate at the head of her class in 1885 and begin teaching the youngest grade herself in the autumn of 1886. In the autumn of 1881, the first child of Silas and Della Hollister was born in the cedar-smelling bedroom where Della had once woken from the storm. He was a boy, and they named him Augustus Silas Hollister after the marshal who had ridden up the Bitterroot Road in the gray dawn to bring Cyrus Mercer to a courtroom, and after his father. Silas Hollister, who could split a cord of wood in an afternoon without his hands trembling, held his newborn son in those big scarred hands, and his hands shook the way Della had never seen them shake, and he cried, and he was not ashamed. In the spring of 1885, a daughter came, and they named her Verity Lenora Hollister, after the truth that had set the cabin free, and after the woman who had written the letter that had carried it. Della Hollister rocked her daughter in the same rocking chair where she had once read Sonnet 43 3 times by the fire, and on the small table beside the chair lay the same slim volume of Elizabeth Browning that Silas had once kept on the bottom shelf of his bookcase and now kept on the top. In the summer of 1888, Etta Ashford married a young printer from Helena named Wesley Reed, who was the nephew of the marshal in the same clearing where her older sister had been married 9 years before. Marshal Augustus Reed, by then 60 years old and slowing down a step, gave the bride away. In the winter of 1892, Rhett Hollister married a schoolteacher from Missoula named Alice Pemberton and built a small cabin of his own a half-mile down the trail from the main house. Tobias Hollister never married. He said that the forge and the children of his brothers were enough company for any one man, and he meant it. The young ones called him Uncle Toby, and they came to him to have the broken handles of their toys mended in the forge. And for every child born on the Hollister land, he beat out a small iron horseshoe charm and hung it above the cradle for luck. And the charms still hang in the houses of those children's children today. The Hollister Ranch grew slowly and steadily through the 80s and the 90s. By 1895, it ran more than 900 head on 1,200 acres, and the silver claim on the back of the mountain still paid out a small, steady trickle to the assay office in Helena every quarter. They never moved out of the original cabin. They added rooms to it. They built a long porch all the way around it. They put up a second story over the kitchen wing, and they built a bathhouse with hot pipe water from a spring up the slope. But the heart of the cabin remained the long main room with the great stone hearth and the heavy plank table, and the table was the same table where Della Ashford had once sat down with a green ledger and a stack of foolscap and the truth. In the summer of 1908, on a long warm evening at the end of June, Della Hollister sat in a rocking chair on the porch. She had crossed for the first time 30 years before in the snow with a ring in her hand. Her hair was still the color of honey, but there was silver running through it now at the temples, and her cornflower blue eyes were the same eyes, only they had 30 more years of fire and weather behind them. She was 52 years old. On the table beside her was a tin cup of black coffee in the same slim volume of Elizabeth Browning, and on the floor beside her chair was a yellow dog who was the great-great-grandson of the yellow dog who had once sat in the snow behind a half-grown calf. Down on the south slope of the meadow in the long blue evening light, 5 children were running through the new grass. Augustus Silas Hollister, 27 years old now, and a man with his father's whiskey-colored eyes was teaching his 3-year-old son how to sit in a small saddle on the back of a small, shaggy bay pony. Verity Lenore, 23, was sitting under the broken pine reading aloud from a book of poems to her younger cousin. The 2 youngest children running across the meadow were the small son and daughter of Etta and Wesley Reed, who had come up from Helena for the summer. Summer the way they did every year. Red Hollister, 57 now and gray in the beard, was leaning on the corral fence watching his eldest son, a long-limbed boy of 15, try to lasso a fence post. Tobias Hollister, 60 years old, was at the open door of the forge with one of the small iron horseshoe charms cooling on the anvil for his newest niece, the infant daughter of Etta and Wesley Reed. The screen door of the porch opened and Silas Hollister came out. He was 63 years old. His chestnut hair had gone entirely silver. His shoulders were not quite as wide as they had once been, and he walked a little more carefully on his left knee on cold mornings. But his whiskey-colored eyes were still the eyes that had looked at his wife on the porch on the 18th of December of 1878, with a face going pale at the sight of her. He sat down in the rocking chair beside hers. He set his hand over hers on the arm of her chair. He looked out over the south meadow at the children in the long blue light. "I have been thinking," he said, "about that ring." Della smiled without looking at him. She knew which ring. There was only one ring in this house that anyone would say it about. "You held it out to me on this porch," Silas said, "and you asked me if I would buy it. And I told you that gold was not for eating and that this house did not work in such trade. I want to tell you tonight on this porch, 30 years to the season, since you said it to me, that I was wrong about the trade in the only way that mattered. The gold was not for eating. The gold was for remembering. You held out a piece of your mother's love, and you offered it to a stranger to keep yourself alive one more day, and I did not understand until much later that the only honest answer to such an offer is to spend the rest of your life trying to be worth it. I have spent 30 years trying. I do not know that I have managed it, but I have tried." Della turned her hand under his and laced her fingers through his fingers. She did not answer right away. The yellow dog at her feet stretched and made a small, contented sound. Down on the south meadow, Augustus Silas was lifting his small son down off the pony and setting him on his feet in the grass. And the small boy was laughing the way only 3-year-old boys laugh, and the laugh came up the slope to the porch on the warm air. "Silas Hollister," she said, "I will tell you tonight on this porch the thing I have known since the morning after the storm and have never said to you out loud because some things do not need to be said. You did not need to be worth it. You only needed to open the door. Everything else you and I built the way Toby built the forge and Rhett built the corral and your father built this cabin. Everything in this house, everything in this meadow, everything I am looking at right now, every child running in that grass is the answer to a question my father asked me when I was 15 years old in the back office of his store. He asked me whether I would ever be a woman who could not be cheated. I have not been cheated, Silas. I came west with a ring in my hem, and I have ended up with a life I would not trade for any life ever lived in any city in this country, and the only price I paid for it was 3 days of walking through a snow that almost killed me. And 3 days is not a price. 3 days is a passage. I would walk those 3 days again tonight if it brought me to this porch." Silas Hollister did not speak for a long moment. He looked out at the meadow. He looked at his sons and his daughter and his grandchildren and his brothers in the long blue evening of his 63rd year, and his eyes were wet at the inside corners the way they had been wet in the firelight on the night Della had told him that the storm had not been his fault and he was not ashamed of it. The yellow dog stood up and walked once around the rocking chair and laid down again with his head on the toe of Della's boot. Down in the meadow, 3-year-old Edmund Silas Hollister, named for the grandfather he had never met and for the grandfather who was sitting on the porch above him, at that very moment broke away from his father and came running up the long slope of the south meadow toward the porch with both small arms held out and his face full of the absolute certainty that the woman in the rocking chair would catch him when he reached her. And she did. She caught him, and she lifted him onto her lap, and she pressed her face into the warm hair on the top of his small head, and she breathed in the smell of summer grass and clean child and the cabin smoke that lived in the wool of his small jacket, and she thought the way she had thought 1,000 times in 30 years, and would think 1,000 times more, that this was the answer to the question. This boy on her lap, this porch under her chair, this man's hand in her hand, this valley, this life. She still remembered, sometimes in the slow hours of an early morning, the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Silver Creek on the 15th of December of 1878, with no man waiting and no money in her pocket, and a gold ring stitched into the hem of her dress. She remembered the wind in the timber on the third afternoon of her walking. She remembered the first sip of coffee at a long plank table on a morning when a tall, quiet man had set a chair 3 places away from her and told her that the conversation about the contract did not happen until the thaw. 30 years later, on the porch of the cabin he had built her, she understood at last what the man had meant. He had meant that some conversations only become possible when winter ends. He had meant that some doors only open to the people who walk far enough to find them. He had meant that some women come west with nothing in their hands, and some men come down off up mountains with nothing in their hearts. And now and then, by the grace of God, in the stubbornness of the human will, in the courage of a little gold ring carried through a storm, the woman and the man arrive at the same porch at the same hour, and they look at each other and they know. The sun went down behind the Bitterroot Range. The long blue light turned to gold and then to lavender and then to the deep, clean dark of a Montana summer night, and the first stars came out over the valley, and the small boy on Della Hollister's lap fell asleep with his cheek against the front of her dress, and Silas Hollister's hand never left hers, and somewhere in the soft air of the meadow a yellow dog turned in his sleep and sighed, and a 30-year storm came at last to its ending, and this is where their story rests.